She was carrying a Barrett 50 caliber rifle across an active military base, and not a single person looked twice. They saw a woman, quiet, lean, unremarkable. They did not see the notebook in her left breast pocket filled with wind calculations. They did not see the way her eyes tracked the heat shimmer off the eastern ridge like a predator reading terrain. They did not see that she had already ranged every significant target on this base before breakfast. 2 hours later, a call sign crackled through every radio on Fort Raven Ridge, Ghost Viper, and every veteran in the compound went completely still. If this story gripped you in the first 10 seconds, you're exactly where you need to be. Subscribe to the channel, hit that notification bell, and drop your city and country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now stay with me, because what happens next changes everything. The desert didn't care about rank. It treated everyone the same, cooked them slow, dried them out, and made their eyes ache from squinting into a horizon that never changed. At 0612 hours, Fort Raven Ridge was already heating up fast, the kind of dry, punishing heat that turned sand into something that felt like standing glass when the wind moved. The base sat in a shallow depression between two ridgelines, which the brass liked because it offered natural cover from long-range observation. What the brass didn't say, but every soldier on the ground understood, was that it also made the base a bowl, and a bowl in the desert collected heat the way a wound collects infection. Corporal Elise Vance had been awake since 0430. She sat with her back against the eastern perimeter wall, in the narrow strip of shadow that the concrete barrier cast before the sun climbed high enough to erase it entirely. The shadow would be gone in 40 minutes. She wasn't planning to move. In front of her, field stripped across a worn canvas mat, lay the Barrett M107A1 semi-automatic rifle. The weapon was enormous by any standard, a 50 caliber anti-material platform that weighed close to 30 pounds fully configured, nearly 5 feet long from muzzle to buttstock. It was built to punch through engine blocks and light armor at distances that other rifles couldn't even range. Most snipers on the base shot the M24 or the newer MRAD. A few ran the MK21. The Barrett was a specialist tool, reserved for a specific category of mission that required a specific category of operator. Nobody had figured out what category Elise Vance fit into. She worked a bore brush through the barrel with slow, deliberate strokes, the metal-on-metal sound barely audible over the ambient noise of the base coming to life around her. Somewhere on the far side of the motor pool, a diesel engine turned over and died. A radio crackled from the guard post 20 meters to her left. 2 soldiers from Bravo Company walked the perimeter and glanced at her as they passed. One of them said something to the other laughed. Elise didn't look up. She set the bore brush aside, lifted the upper receiver, and held it up against the pale morning sky to check the bore alignment. Her movements were unhurried and economical in the way that only comes from repetition, not the rehearsed kind, but the kind that gets burned into muscle memory from doing something thousands of times across years and conditions that most people never encounter. Her notebook sat open on the mat beside her. It was a small thing, military issue, green cover, water-resistant, but the pages inside were dense with writing that had nothing to do with standard field notes. Column after column of numbers. Temperature readings, humidity percentages, elevation changes, wind vectors recorded at different times of morning. Down one margin, she had written a series of Coriolis correction factors for this specific latitude. At the bottom of one page, barely legible, was a phrase in her own handwriting: "Every problem has a solution. Find the information." She'd written that 5 years ago. She still believed it. "You're in the wrong spot." The voice came from her right. She didn't startle. She looked up. Private First Class Danny Okafor stood at the edge of her canvas mat, holding 2 paper cups of coffee. He was 22, maybe 23, broad through the shoulders, but still carrying that untested quality that combat hadn't had a chance to sand off yet. He'd arrived at Fort Raven Ridge 11 weeks ago as part of a replacement cycle. Elise had learned his name by reading the duty roster, not by any interaction he'd initiated. This was the first time he'd ever spoken to her directly. "Rifle range is on the west end," he said. He held out one of the cups. Elise looked at the cup, then at him. Then she took it. "I know where the rifle range is," she said. "Then why are you—" "Because I'm not using the rifle range." Okafor looked at the Barrett, then at the notebook full of numbers, then at the Barrett again. She watched him try to work out what she was doing, and she watched the moment he gave up trying. "Sergeant Briggs says you've been out here every morning for 2 weeks," he said. "Sergeant Briggs pays attention to things that don't concern him. He also says nobody's ever seen you shoot that thing." Elise lifted the coffee and drank. It was terrible. Too weak, too hot, somehow both at once. She drank half of it anyway. "Go finish your patrol, Okafor." He opened his mouth, closed it, nodded once like he'd made some kind of decision, then walked off toward the guard post without looking back. Elise set the cup down, went back to the Barrett, and began reassembling the receiver group. The shadow from the perimeter wall was almost gone. Oh, by 0800, the base had shifted into its operational rhythm, briefings completed, work parties assigned, the administrative machinery of a forward outpost grinding through its daily cycle. Fort Raven Ridge operated as a staging and intelligence hub for regional operations, which meant it ran with a mixed population: infantry elements, intelligence analysts, logistics crews, and various attached personnel whose exact roles were only partly visible on the official manifest. Elise was listed on that manifest as Attached Personnel, Specialist Services. That was intentional. She had asked for the vague designation herself when she arrived 6 weeks ago. Nobody in base administration had pushed back. They'd taken one look at her paperwork, the heavily redacted kind, with entire paragraphs behind thick black bars, and decided not to ask questions that might generate answers they didn't want responsibility for. She drew her meals from the common DFAC, ran her physical training in the early dark before most of the base was awake, and spent her operational hours at the eastern perimeter doing things that looked, from a distance, like obsessive equipment maintenance and note-taking. Sergeant First Class Ron Briggs had a different interpretation. "She's a washout," he said, not particularly quietly, over breakfast in the crowded DFAC. "You look at the gear she's running. That Barrett is a range toy at this point. Nobody gives a weapon like that to somebody they're actually planning to use." 3 soldiers at his table nodded with the easy agreement of men who hadn't been contradicted often enough. "Heard she used to be something," said one of them, Specialist Turk, who had the habit of half-finishing every sentence as though he expected someone else to complete it for him. "Some kind of used to be," Briggs said, cutting him off. "That's the operating term, used to be." He glanced toward the far corner of the DFS, where Elise sat alone with a tray and her notebook, writing something without looking up. "Whatever she was, she isn't anymore. You can see it. Burned out. Somebody's mercy placement, probably. Give her a quiet posting, let her collect a paycheck. She disappears in 8 months when her contract ends." Nobody disagreed. Nobody thought to ask why a burned-out mercy placement was sitting alone before dawn calculating Coriolis drift. The Brigadier General's convoy arrived at 10:20 hours, with the kind of controlled commotion that high-ranking visitors always generated. Vehicles moving in tight formation, gate guards suddenly finding their posture, junior enlisted straightening equipment, and pretending they'd been squared away all morning. Brigadier General Marcus Hale was not the kind of officer who announced himself with noise. He was 61, compact and lean, in the way that men who maintain strict physical discipline into late career tend to be, with close-cropped gray hair and the permanently unimpressed expression of someone who had been lied to by too many subordinates to take anything at face value. He had 2 stars, and the kind of operational history that showed up in redacted budget justifications and classified after-action reviews rather than public citations. He didn't do surprise inspections because he enjoyed theater. He did them because he believed that the gap between what a unit reported and what a unit actually was could only be measured by unannounced observation. He walked the base with Colonel Dressler, the fort commander, and 2 aides who took notes on everything Hale pointed at and said nothing unless directly asked. Dressler was sweating lightly and explaining things in the preemptive way of a man who suspects he's about to be criticized. They moved through the motor pool, the armory, the communications center. Hale asked questions that were precise and unwelcome. He found 3 maintenance discrepancies in the vehicle bay, a radio encryption protocol that hadn't been updated in 11 days, and a personnel duty log with entries that didn't match the physical reality of who was standing where. "This isn't a catastrophe," he told Dressler, in a tone that made catastrophe sound like the better alternative. "It's negligence. Negligence compounds. You understand that?" "Yes, sir. We'll have corrective action. I don't need a promise, Colonel. I need it done." They moved toward the eastern perimeter. Hale was mid-sentence about the guard rotation gap when he saw her. A woman, sitting against the wall with a large caliber rifle partially reassembled on a mat in front of her. She had the bolt group in one hand and a small notebook in the other, and she was cross-referencing something between the two with the focused inward attention of someone doing math that required silence. He slowed for half a step. His eyes moved to the Barrett, registered it, moved to the notebook. Dressler, half a pace behind him, kept talking. Hale started walking again. He filed it. The woman, the rifle, the notebook, in the part of his mind where things went when he wasn't sure what to do with them yet. Not important. Probably maintenance detail. The Barrett might be assigned to a unit coming through. He had a perimeter schedule to finish reviewing. He kept walking. Elise watched him go. She had made Hale from about 200 meters the moment the convoy came through the gate. 2-star. Operational background. You could see it in the way he moved, measuring angles and distances automatically, head on a slight swivel even while he was talking, not ceremonial brass, the real kind. He had looked at her for exactly 1.8 seconds. She'd counted, then nothing. She went back to her notebook. 9.7 hours. Temperature 94 GF, rising. Wind from northwest at 6 knots, variable. Humidity 11%. Mirage factor high. Heat bloom off eastern ridge starting at approximately 800 mists, consistent with yesterday's pattern. Solution window 0930 to 115, again at 600 to 1800 before thermal inversion. She closed the notebook, picked up the bolt group, continued working. 30 meters away, Private Okafor watched her from the guard post with an expression that had changed since their morning conversation. The easy dismissal he'd borrowed from Briggs was still there, but it had developed a small crack in it, the kind that forms when you start to suspect you've been given secondhand information about something you don't actually understand. He watched her hands move over the Barrett components. He'd been around weapons his whole adult life. He knew what competence looked like. He wasn't sure what he was looking at. The mission alert arrived at 1347 hours. It came through the command center's secure channel as a Priority 1 contact report, the kind that bypassed normal routing and went directly to every station simultaneously with a tone that nobody on the base had heard in 6 weeks. The duty officer, Lieutenant Kavanaugh, had the alert up on the main display before the tone finished and was already reaching for the operations phone. Colonel Dressler appeared in the doorway of the command center 40 seconds later. He was breathing hard from moving fast, which he tried to conceal and failed. "What do we have?" "High-value contact, sir." Kavanaugh turned the screen toward him. "Fixed position, Eastern Ridge, confirmed by 2 separate ISR sources. Target is stationary. Vehicle and personnel signature consistent with priority designator Sierra 3. Dressler looked at the screen for a long moment. Sierra 3 was a designation that didn't get used lightly. It referenced a specific tier of intelligence subject, someone whose removal carried strategic weight that went beyond tactical value. Distance: 3,850 meters from the eastern observation point. Beyond that, the terrain drops and there's an overhang that gives partial concealment. He's not exposed to air assets without a flight profile that'll burn the operation. So it's a ground solution. If it's going to happen in the window we have, yes, sir. Dressler turned to his senior sniper team element, Sergeant First Class Briggs, and his 2-man team, which had been assembled in the back of the room within 3 minutes of the alert. "What do you need?" Briggs had already pulled the ranging data. He looked at it, and the look on his face was the kind that experienced soldiers develop when they're doing the honest math on something they don't want to say out loud. 3850 meters in these conditions. He spread the datasheet flat on the table. Temperature's 101 right now and climbing. Wind off the northern ridge is inconsistent. We're getting 2 to 4 knot variance every 8 to 12 minutes. Heat shimmer is making observation extremely unreliable past about 2,000 meters. At 3,850. Can you make the shot? Briggs paused. Sir, a confident answer to that is probably not something I can give you today. We're looking at environmental conditions that push this outside the reliable engagement envelope with the platforms we're running. I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm saying the probability of a first-round hit at that distance in a 101-degree day with variable wind and severe mirage is, give me a number. Another pause. Below 40%, sir. Below 40 in the first window. and we don't know how long the target holds. The room got quiet in the specific way that rooms get quiet when the available options have all been laid out and none of them are good. Dressler stood with his hands flat on the operations table, staring at the satellite image of the ridge. Then the secure radio channel on the far wall activated. It didn't ring. It didn't tone. It simply opened, a soft static hiss, and then a voice came through, controlled and unhurried, like someone making a routine weather report. Raven Ridge Command, this is a request for authorization. Ghost Viper, Authentication Kilo 7 Foxtrot, requesting engagement clearance. Eastern Ridge, Sierra 3 target. Confirm channel secure. Kavanaugh looked at Dressler. Dressler looked at the radio. Briggs, across the room, had gone completely still. Ghost Viper. The call sign hung in the air of the command center like a word in a language everyone recognized but hadn't heard spoken in years. Dressler moved to the radio, picked up the handset. This channel is secure. Authentication acknowledged. His voice was careful, measured. The voice of a man trying to figure out what he was dealing with. Identify yourself for the operational record. A pause of exactly 3 seconds. Corporal Elise Vance. Attached personnel, Fort Raven Ridge. I'm already in position. Nobody in the command center moved. Briggs, who had spent 2 weeks constructing a detailed and confident theory about who Elise Vance was, stood at the back of the room with his data sheet in his hand and said absolutely nothing. Because Ghost Viper was not a call sign you invented. You didn't claim that name. You didn't assume it. It was earned under conditions that most of the people in this room had never been anywhere near, documented in a file that most of them didn't have clearance to read, and attached to a mission record that, if you knew enough to look for it, would show you a list of engagements that shouldn't have been possible. Ghost Viper was one of 6 call signs in the entire theater that carried a standing pre-authorization for independent engagement on Sierra-class targets. Or it had been. 2 years ago. Before whatever happened had happened. Before the name disappeared. Dressler set the handset down, looked at Kavanaugh. Get me everything we have on Corporal Vance. Everything. Kavanaugh was already typing. Dressler looked at the satellite feed, the eastern ridge, the target position, the impossible distance, and then at the clock. The window was already shrinking, and somewhere outside these walls, in the punishing heat of a Fort Raven Ridge morning, the woman that everyone had walked past, dismissed, and forgotten about was carrying a Barrett .50 caliber rifle toward an observation point with the calm deliberateness of someone who had already run this problem and arrived at an answer. She had been running it for 6 weeks. She had known this ridge since her first morning here. The calculations in her notebook weren't obsession, they were preparation. And in the command center, as junior analysts pulled up a personnel file and found themselves looking at redaction after redaction after redaction, entire mission records behind black bars, a commendation list that cut off abruptly 2 years ago, a 2-word notation at the bottom of the disciplinary section that someone had tried to bury under administrative language. Lieutenant Kavanaugh said, very quietly, to no one in particular, "Who is she?" Briggs, still standing at the back of the room with his data sheet, recognized the sensation moving through him. He'd felt it once before, years ago, standing in the aftermath of an engagement that he'd been told was impossible. It was the feeling of being wrong in a way that couldn't be walked back. Outside, the heat had reached its worst point of the day. The thermometer mounted on the eastern perimeter wall read 103 degrees Fahrenheit, and the number felt honest, the kind of heat that pressed against exposed skin like a hand, that made the air above the sand shimmer and roll in slow waves that distorted distance and bent light into shapes that looked like water, but were nothing. The desert was lying to every optical instrument on the base, and it had been lying since 0930. Elise walked through it like she'd been built for it. She moved along the inside of the perimeter wall toward the eastern observation point, a reinforced concrete platform elevated 4 feet above grade, equipped with a mounted spotting scope that hadn't been properly calibrated in 3 weeks. She knew that because she'd checked it on day 2. She'd recalibrated it herself without asking permission or explaining what she was doing, and nobody had noticed. The Barrett was slung across her back on a padded carry harness she'd modified herself, redistributing the weight across her shoulders and lower back for a long carry in heat. 30 pounds. She barely showed it. Okafor was at the guard post adjacent to the observation platform. He saw her coming and stepped out of the post's shadow with the specific expression of someone who is trying to decide whether to say something or stay quiet and has already spent too long making that decision. Corporal Vance, get off the platform, she said. Not unkindly, just clearly. He got off the platform. She climbed the 4 steps to the elevated deck, set the Barrett's case down, and began unfolding the bipod legs with practiced efficiency. The concrete surface of the platform was hot enough to be uncomfortable through boot soles. She didn't adjust for it. She set the rifle's bipod down on the surface and felt the heat radiating up through the metal immediately, noted it, added it to her working calculations. Metal expansion, barrel temperature. Effect on chamber pressure, marginal, at this range, but not zero. Nothing was zero at 3,150 meters. She settled behind the rifle. The spotting scope was 3 feet to her left, already oriented toward the eastern ridge. She'd positioned it yesterday, under the guise of a routine perimeter check that nobody had questioned because she'd walked the perimeter every afternoon and everyone had long since stopped tracking what she was doing out here. She pressed her eye to the scope. The eastern ridge came into focus, or as close to focus as the heat bloom permitted. The air above the ground was moving in thick, slow columns of distorted light, the kind of visual interference that turned a clear line of sight into something closer to looking through old glass. At this distance, a human-sized target would look like a smudge that moved. She found it. The smudge. It was stationary, partially concealed by the rock overhang that the satellite imagery had identified, and it hadn't moved in the 11 minutes she'd been running her final calculations before coming to the platform. Stationary targets were better than moving ones. Stationary targets in partial concealment were trickier because the exposed portion was smaller, which meant the margin for error contracted accordingly. At 3,150 meters, the margin was already so thin it barely existed. She settled deeper into the rifle. Her radio, a small encrypted handset clipped to her left shoulder, crackled once. Ghost Viper, this is Raven Ridge Command. Authorization is pending verification. Hold position. Dressler's voice. Careful. Buying time. She keyed the handset. Holding. Target is stationary. Partial concealment. Eastern overhang. Wind is cycling northwest at approximately 5 knots with a 7 to 9 knot gust cycle running every 11 minutes. I'm tracking the pattern. Give me the authorization before the next gust window closes. A pause. What's your confidence level? Elise watched the heat shimmer, watched the dust at the base of the ridge, the tiny particles that moved with the wind at ground level, which was different from the wind at height, which was different again from the wind at the midpoint of the bullet's arc. 3 separate wind environments that the bullet would pass through in sequence. She had data on all 3. She'd been collecting it since 0430. High, she said. Define high. First round probability above 80%. If the wind holds to pattern. Another pause. Longer. Stand by. She went back to the scope. Ok. In the command center, the pause was filled with the sound of men making decisions they weren't comfortable with. Dressler had the personnel file on the screen in front of him now. What was visible of it, Kavanaugh had pulled everything the base's clearance level could access, which turned out to be considerably less than anyone had hoped. The file was a document that had been through a redaction process so thorough it was almost architectural. Entire pages reduced to headers and black bars. Mission logs with dates but no content. An evaluation history that ran clean and exceptional for 11 years and then simply stopped, replaced by a 2-page administrative finding that used a lot of neutral language to describe something that had clearly not been neutral at all. She was elite, Kavanaugh said, almost to himself. He was reading what little remained. 11 years of service, active deployment record across 4 theaters, qualification ratings. He stopped. Read something. Read it again. Sir, her qual ratings on the Barrett platform are the highest I've ever seen in a personnel file. What happened 2 years ago? Something called Operation Black Meridian. The file references it, but the content is completely blocked. All I've got is the administrative outcome. She was removed from active sniper operations and reassigned to what's listed as support functions. No explanation, no formal misconduct finding, just removed. Dressler looked at Briggs. Briggs, for the first time in the conversation, looked genuinely uncomfortable. You know something, Dressler said. I know rumors, sir. Nothing verified. Tell me the rumors. Briggs shifted his weight. There was talk, about 2 years ago, in the sniper community. Something went wrong on a classified OP. The story was that a shot was missed, target wasn't eliminated, the operation blew up. The operator on the trigger took the fall. He paused. I never heard a name attached to it. I didn't know it was her. And if it wasn't a missed shot? Briggs had no answer to that. The radio crackled. Command, wind is shifting. I have a pattern break. Gusts are running early. I need a decision in the next 4 minutes, or the window closes for approximately 40 minutes. Dressler looked at the clock, looked at the satellite feed, looked at the personnel file on the screen with its wall of black bars hiding whatever truth had been buried in there 2 years ago. He picked up the handset. Ghost Viper, you have authorization. Cleared hot. A pause of exactly 1 second. Understood. Going quiet. The channel stayed open but went silent. In the command center, nobody spoke. Bob. Elise pulled the earpiece out of her left ear and set the handset down beside her on the platform. Going quiet meant exactly that. No more radio until it was done. Radio created a divided attention, and divided attention at this distance was the same as missing. She couldn't afford distraction. She couldn't afford anything except the shot. She settled. The Barrett stock found the familiar position against her shoulder, the slight angle, the cheek weld that she'd shaped through thousands of repetitions until it was as automatic as breathing. Her right hand wrapped the pistol grip with measured pressure. Not tight. Tight was wrong. Tight transmitted shake. The grip was firm and still, the kind of stillness you build over years of discipline until your hands stop being hands and start being mechanical supports. She closed her left eye. Her right eye, through the Schmidt and Bender scope, 5-25x magnification, currently dialed to its upper range, found the eastern ridge. The heat bloom was worse now. The midday thermals were fully developed, thick columns of hot air rising from the superheated ground and bending the light into a visual landscape that bore only approximate resemblance to what was actually there. A lesser shooter would have called the shot unworkable. The environment was simply too degraded, too unstable, too full of variables that couldn't be controlled. Elise wasn't trying to control them, she was listening to them. Her eyes moved off the target, to the dust, to the sparse desert scrub at the ridge base, the way it moved and bent and stilled, to the heat columns themselves, their direction and rhythm, to a piece of torn fabric caught on a rock outcropping at the 1,200-meter line, which had been her wind indicator since yesterday afternoon, because it was exactly where she needed data and the base didn't have a wind sensor there. The desert was telling her things. It always was. Most people didn't know the language. She'd learned it over 11 years in places that didn't show up on any map that could be publicly acknowledged. The fabric shifted, stilled, shifted again. 5 knots. Trending to hold. She made a final adjustment to the elevation turret. 1 click, felt it, accepted it. Her breathing slowed without deliberate effort. Her body had long since learned to do this automatically when she was behind the glass, and the world had narrowed to a single point. Her heart rate dropped. Not to nothing, not the myth of the perfectly still shooter, but to a slow, controlled rhythm that she could work between. She'd learned years ago that the myth of the heartbeat-free shot was exactly that. You didn't eliminate the heartbeat, you worked with it. You found the valley between beats, the still point, and you timed the trigger break to live there. She watched the target smudge in the distorted glass. Stationary. Still partial concealment. The exposed portion was the right shoulder and upper torso, angled slightly toward her, which gave her a cross-section that was smaller than ideal and slightly asymmetrical. The bullet path would need to account for the angle. She'd already run the geometry. She knew where to put it. The wind held. She found the still point. She broke the trigger. The Barrett fired. The sound was enormous and immediate. A concussive crack that rolled across the base like something structural had failed. A sound so large it was physical, felt in the chest cavity, before the brain processed it as noise. On the guard post below the observation platform, Okafor grabbed the post wall with both hands without meaning to. The recoil moved Elise backward, and she came back to the scope in a single practiced motion, recovering the sight picture in under 2 seconds. The heat bloom made the far ridge indistinct. She watched, counted. At 3,850 meters, a .50 BMG round at standard muzzle velocity takes approximately 5.3 seconds to reach the target, assuming the ballistic arc and environmental drift fall, within calculated parameters. She counted to 5, then to 6, because the wind had been on the soft edge of her correction window and she'd built in the margin. The radio crackled. A voice, not Dressler, one of the forward observation posts that had eyes on the ridge through a different angle, came through tight and controlled. Raven Ridge, this is OP4. Impact confirmed. Target is down. Single round. Elise released a breath she hadn't been fully aware she was holding. Not relief. Not satisfaction. Something quieter and more functional than either. The recognition that the calculation had been correct, that the information had been sufficient, that the problem had been solved. She lifted her eye from the scope. The desert stretched out in front of her, massive and indifferent, the heat shimmer still rolling off the ground in slow waves that made the horizon look like something that couldn't be trusted. She began the post-shot sequence. Safety on. Bolt cleared. Muzzle checked. She did each step in order without rushing, because the discipline of the sequence existed for reasons that didn't disappear just because the pressure was over. Below her, on the ground beside the platform, Private Okafor was staring up at her with an expression that she recognized because she'd seen it before. On other faces. In other places. It was the look of someone who had been operating on a wrong assumption for long enough that having it corrected felt less like learning something and more like losing something. She said nothing to him. She picked up the handset. Raven Ridge Command, Ghost Viper. Shot complete. Single round. I'll need access to the recovered materials from the target site when your team reaches the position. A pause. Copy, Ghost Viper. And good shooting. She looked at the radio without responding to that part. Good shooting. As though that was what this morning had been about. She began breaking down the Barrett. The forward exploitation team reached the target position 47 minutes later, moving along the ridge under escort from a quick reaction element that Dressler had pushed out immediately after confirmation. The target site was exactly where the ISR had placed it, a shallow observation post constructed with professional skill into a natural rock formation, the kind of prepared hide that took time and knowledge to build correctly. The man was dead where he'd been positioned. The round had done what .50 caliber rounds do at any range where they arrive intact, which is to say the outcome was not ambiguous. The team's medic confirmed it in under 30 seconds and moved on to the more important work. There was equipment, there was documentation. There was a ruggedized field laptop with encryption running on a military-adjacent protocol that the team's signals specialist identified immediately as non-commercial, the kind of communications infrastructure that cost real money and required real institutional support. And there was a folder, physical documents in a waterproof case bearing classification markers that 2 members of the exploitation team had never seen before, and one had seen exactly once, under circumstances he'd never been authorized to discuss. The team leader photographed everything and transmitted the images back to the command center via the secure data link. When the images arrived on Kavanaugh's screen, he opened them in sequence. He got to the 4th image. He stopped. He looked at it for a long moment, making sure he was reading it correctly. Then he said, "Sir, you need to see this." Dressler crossed the room and looked at the screen. The document was a mission coordination record. It referenced an operation by name, a name that was supposed to exist only in classified archives, buried under administrative language so dense that even people with the right clearance had difficulty finding it. The name on the document was Operation Black Meridian. The date was 2 years ago. And the coordination record showed something that turned Dressler's face into a careful, unreadable mask. The practiced neutrality of a senior officer who has just seen something that requires him to be very precise about what he does next. The man on the ridge, the Sierra 3 target that Elise had just eliminated at 3,250 meters in impossible conditions, had not been a random high-value contact. He had been connected to the original operation that destroyed her career, connected in a way that suggested he knew things, that suggested the story everyone had been told about what happened 2 years ago was not the story that had actually happened. Dressler straightened, looked at the command center around him, the duty officers, the analysts, the signals staff, looked at Briggs still standing at the back of the room. Then he looked at the door. Because somewhere outside that door, Elise Vance was breaking down her rifle and preparing to carry it back to whatever quiet corner of this base she'd been occupying for 6 weeks, the same way she'd done every day since she arrived. And the question that had started this morning as, who is she, had just become something considerably more complicated. It had become, what did they do to her? And underneath that, quieter and colder, who did it? Dressler stood in front of that screen for a long time. Not because he was slow, because he was being careful. There is a specific kind of careful that senior officers develop when they realize they are standing at the edge of something that has institutional weight behind it. The kind of weight that crushes people who move wrong, who ask the wrong questions to the wrong people, who pull at a thread without first understanding what the thread is attached to. Dressler had been in uniform for 28 years. He knew what that kind of careful felt like. It felt like this. "Who else has seen this?" he said. Kavanaugh looked around the room. "Everyone currently on shift, sir." The images came through on the main display. Dressler nodded slowly. "Lock the channel. Restrict the document images to this terminal only. Nobody discusses what's in those files outside this room until I say otherwise." "Sir, that's not a suggestion, Lieutenant." Kavanaugh turned back to his terminal without another word. Briggs, at the back of the room, watched all of this with the expression of a man who understood exactly what was happening and had decided, at least for now, that the correct response was to say nothing and remain very still. Dressler straightened his uniform jacket. A small, habitual gesture, the kind people make when they're buying themselves 2 seconds to think, and walked to the door. "Find Corporal Vance," he said, without turning around. "Tell her I need to see her in my office. Don't make it an order, just tell her." He left. The command center held its collective breath for exactly 3 seconds after the door closed. Then everyone went back to their screens with the studied focus of people who had just witnessed something they were not going to talk about. Elise was at the eastern perimeter wall when the runner found her. She had the Barrett fully broken down and packed, the canvas mat folded and strapped to the outside of the case, and she was in the process of writing the final environmental data from the morning into her notebook, the actual wind readings, the thermal cycle timing, the scope temperature across the engagement window. She kept records on every shot she had ever taken, not for documentation purposes. For the same reason a surgeon keeps notes on procedures that go wrong and procedures that go right, because the information was the point, and losing information was the same as losing capability. The runner was Okafor. Of course it was Okafor. He jogged up to her with the careful energy of someone trying to look like they weren't nervous and failing at it, and he relayed Dressler's message word for word, which told Elise that Dressler had been precise with his language. "Tell her. Don't make it an order." That was interesting. She closed the notebook, looked at Okafor. "You were there when the round went," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, Corporal." "What did you hear?" He blinked. The shot. It was loud. I've been around heavy weapons before, but that was..." He stopped, started again. "And then the radio. OP4 called it confirmed." "What did you think?" Okafor looked at her for a moment with the honest discomfort of someone being asked to say something that might be wrong. "I thought I'd made a serious mistake," he said, "about who you were." Elise picked up the Barrett case by its carry handle. "You didn't make a mistake," she said. "You made an assumption based on the information you had. That's different." She started walking toward the main building. "The mistake is not updating the assumption when the information changes." Okafor stood there for a second, then fell into step behind her without being asked to. She let him. Dressler's office was at the rear of the command building, a spare room that smelled of instant coffee and recirculated air, with a plywood desk that had seen better decades and a single window that looked out over the motor pool. He was sitting behind the desk when Elise came in. He had a folder in front of him, closed, and his hands flat on top of it, and he looked like a man who had rehearsed several versions of this conversation and was now discovering that none of them applied. Elise sat in the chair across from him without being invited to. He noticed that, filed it. "Good work this morning," he said. "You didn't ask me here to tell me that." A pause. "No," he said. "I didn't." He looked at the folder under his hands, then back at her. The exploitation team recovered materials from the target site. Documents. Some of them reference an operation that... He stopped, chose his next words with visible care. "An operation that your file also references, in its administrative section." Elise said nothing. "Operation Black Meridian," Dressler said. The name landed in the room and stayed there. Elise's face didn't change. Her hands, resting in her lap, didn't move. But something shifted in the quality of her stillness. Not anxiety, not surprise, something older and more controlled than either. The stillness of someone who has been waiting for a specific conversation for a long time and has made peace with the fact that when it arrived, it was going to be difficult. "What do the documents say?" she said. "I'm not in a position to share the full content yet, but I need to understand about the man on the ridge. Did you know who he was before today?" "I knew what he was." "That's not what I asked." She looked at him steadily. "I knew his function, not his name. I've been working on identifying the network structure for the past 8 months. He was a node, a significant one." Dressler leaned back in his chair. The chair made a sound that belonged in a different, less tense conversation. 8 months? He said. "Yes." "On whose authorization?" "Mine." He stared at her. "Corporal, you're attached to this base as support personnel. You don't have an active operational mandate. What you're describing is the reason I requested this posting," she said. Her voice was even, not aggressive, not apologetic, simply direct. "The Eastern Ridge is a known transit corridor for the network I've been mapping. I've been here 6 weeks. Today was the first time an exploitable target appeared in a position and window that made engagement viable. And you just set yourself up as an independent sniper operation on a forward base without telling anyone." "I told the people who needed to know." "Who?" She looked at him with an expression that was almost patient. "If I could answer that question openly, Colonel, I wouldn't be listed as attached personnel with a redacted file." Dressler opened his mouth, closed it. The frustration on his face was real, and she didn't blame him for it. He was a competent officer operating with incomplete information in a situation where the incomplete information was the deliberate result of decisions made by people above both of them. He tapped the folder. "The documents from the site," he said. "They're going to generate a significant inquiry. You understand that?" "I expected that." "An Operation Black Meridian. Whatever happened on that operation, whatever's in the classified record, it's going to come up. People are going to ask questions." "Good," Elise said. The word was quiet and flat and absolute, and it stopped Dressler completely. "Good," she said again. "Let them ask." She left his office 7 minutes later without the conversation having resolved anything, which was, she understood, probably the correct outcome given how much Dressler didn't yet know. He was a fair man doing an honest job, and he'd been handed a problem that required context he didn't have. That wasn't his failure. That was the design. The design was what she'd been working against for 2 years. She walked down the corridor of the command building and pushed through the exterior door into the full weight of the afternoon heat. It hit her like a physical thing. The temperature had climbed while she was inside, the sun now at an angle that gave no shadow cover along the building's south face. She stopped, stood there for a moment in the heat. 2 years. 8 months of self-directed investigation, on top of 2 years of having her career systematically dismantled by people who needed her to be the story rather than the truth. She had not come to Fort Raven Ridge because she'd been assigned here. She had come here because of 47 pages of cross-referenced intelligence data that she'd assembled in a rented room in a city she'd rather not think about, working from documents that she'd obtained through methods that would generate their own uncomfortable questions if anyone looked closely. She had come here because the network that had burned her had a node that used this corridor. And now that node was dead, and the documents on his hard drive and in his waterproof case were going to start pulling at threads that led back to people who had been very comfortable for 2 years, believing those threads were permanently buried. She started walking. Briggs found her before she made it to the eastern perimeter. He came at her from the direction of the motor pool, moving with the deliberate approach of a man who has decided to do something and wants to get it done before he changes his mind. He was a big man, Briggs, broad through the chest, the kind of build that came from actual physical work rather than a gym, with a face that showed his age in the corners and a jaw that was set in the particular way jaws get set when someone is preparing for a conversation they don't want to have. "Vance." She stopped, turned. They looked at each other for a moment. "You heard the call sign this morning," she said. "Everyone on the command net heard it." "And?" Briggs breathed out through his nose. "And I said some things about you over the past couple weeks that I'm not—" He stopped. Tried a different approach. I misjudged the situation. You misjudged me. Yes. She considered him. He was holding his ground, which she respected more than she expected to. Men like Briggs, who had been confidently wrong and then publicly corrected, tended to go one of two directions. Either they folded completely, which was its own kind of uselessness, or they got defensive and hostile, which was worse. He wasn't doing either. He was standing there being uncomfortable, which was approximately the most honest response available to him. "You've been a sniper how long?" she said. 14 years. Longest shot you've ever made in operational conditions. He didn't hesitate. 2,200 meters. Eastern Province, 2019. And the conditions were good. Wind under 3 knots, stable temperature. "That's a good shot," she said, and she meant it without performance. Briggs looked at her. 3850, he said. "In what we had out there today. That's..." He shook his head. "That's a different category." "It's not a different category, it's the same physics. The information is just harder to collect." "That's not how most people would describe it." "Most people haven't spent 11 years doing it." He nodded slowly. A silence fell between them that wasn't quite comfortable but wasn't hostile either. The silence of two people recalibrating their understanding of each other, which takes time and doesn't respond well to being rushed. "What happened to you?" Briggs said. "Black Meridian. Whatever that was." He met her eyes. "Was it what the rumor said? Missed shot? Operation burned?" She looked at him for a long moment. "What do you think?" she said. He thought about it. Really thought, not the reflexive kind. "I think," he said slowly, "that I just watched you put a single round through a target at 3850 in a 103-degree desert with a mirage factor that would have made me question the shot at half that distance. And I think that whatever happened 2 years ago, a missed shot doesn't fit the profile." Elise picked up the Barrett case. "No," she said, "it doesn't." She walked past him. He turned and watched her go, and the expression on his face was the one that follows a correctly arrived at conclusion that comes with no comfort attached to it. The base changed its quality after 1,600 hours. Not in any dramatic way. The personnel didn't change. The routines didn't change. The physical reality of Fort Raven Ridge remained exactly what it had been at 600. But the information environment had shifted, and information environment shifts change the way people move and speak and look at each other even when nobody is consciously aware that this is happening. Word had spread. Not through any official channel. Dressler's lockdown of the document images had held, technically, but through the organic social transmission that happens in any closed population when something significant occurs. By 1700, every soldier on the base knew 3 things. That a shot had been made at a distance nobody on the base had believed was possible, that the shooter was the woman everyone had been dismissing for 6 weeks, and that the call sign she'd used meant something that they couldn't fully access, but that the veterans on the base clearly recognized. The laughter was gone. The casual contempt that had been the ambient social weather around Elise for her entire time at Fort Raven Ridge had evaporated with the speed that such things always evaporate when the premise that supported them collapses. What replaced it was something more complex. Not respect exactly, not yet, because respect takes longer to build than contempt takes to destroy. What replaced it was a kind of watchful uncertainty. People who had been confident in their reading of her were now unsure, and people who are unsure tend to be quiet. The DFAC at evening chow was noticeably quieter than usual. Elise ate alone, the same as every other night, but the quality of her aloneness had changed. Before, it had been the aloneness of someone excluded. Now it was the aloneness of someone who had chosen. Small difference. Everything, in practice. 2 tables over, 4 soldiers from the intelligence section were talking in low voices about the recovered materials. Not the classified content, which they didn't have access to, but the logistics of it. The fact that an exploitation team had been pushed out, that the materials had been transmitted to command, that something in those materials had caused Dressler to lock down his command center for the better part of an hour. Elise didn't look at them. She ate her food, which was mediocre in the specific institutional way that forward base food is always mediocre, recognizable as nutrition without being recognizable as anything else. And she thought about the target, not the shot. The shot was done. She didn't spend time on completed mechanics. She thought about the documents. The man on the ridge had been careful. The encrypted laptop and the physical documents in the waterproof case suggested someone who understood operational security, who knew that digital alone wasn't enough, and that physical records had their own value as backup. That kind of discipline didn't belong to a peripheral figure. That kind of discipline belonged to someone who carried weight, who knew things that required protection. The question was how much he'd been carrying, and whether whoever had sent him here knew that he'd been carrying it. She set her fork down. That thought had its own gravity. If the network knew what he'd had with him, if they understood the exposure that his elimination created, then what happened next wouldn't be quiet. Networks that had institutional protection and something significant to hide didn't respond to exposure quietly. They responded to it preemptively. She picked up her tray, disposed of it, and walked out of the DFAC. General Hale was still on base. She hadn't known that until she nearly walked into his aide coming out of the command building's rear entrance. The aide, a young captain named Delaney, who had the compressed, efficient manner of someone perpetually managing a schedule, stopped, registered who she was, and got a very specific expression. The expression of someone who has been briefed. Corporal Vance. Captain. General Hale would like to speak with you. Not requests, not asks. Would like. The language of authority exercising politeness because it can afford to. When? Now, if you're available. She looked at him. Lead the way, she said. The meeting was in our briefing room off the main corridor, not Dressler's office, which told her that Hale had taken over the space, which told her something about the weight he was putting behind whatever came next. The room had a central table, 6 chairs, a secure display screen currently showing a map of the Eastern Ridge area with overlays she recognized as ISR data from the morning. Hale was standing when she came in. He looked at her for a moment with the same measuring quality she'd noticed when he walked past her this morning, except this time there was no movement away from it. He was giving her his full attention, the kind that 2 stars buy you the authority to withhold or grant as a deliberate act. Corporal Vance, he said, sit down. She sat. He remained standing, which was a choice. She noted it. He looked at the map on the screen for a moment. I walked past you this morning, he said. Approximately 0830, Eastern Perimeter Wall. Yes, sir. I noticed the rifle. I didn't notice you. He turned from the screen. That bothers me. It shouldn't, sir. It was the appropriate response given the information available. He looked at her like he was deciding something. The documents from the target site, he said. I've reviewed them. Colonel Dressler gave me the full package an hour ago. He moved to the table and sat across from her. They reference Operation Black Meridian in a way that suggests the official account of that operation is significantly incomplete. Elise held his gaze, said nothing. I'm not going to ask you what happened on Black Meridian, Hale said. Not yet. What I'm going to ask is simpler. The network this man was connected to. How long have you been tracking it? 8 months. Alone? Functionally, yes. And the posting here. You arranged this deliberately. I identified the transit corridor 6 months ago. The posting request went through appropriate channels. Appropriate channels. He repeated the phrase without particular inflection, but the lack of inflection was itself a comment. Someone approved a heavily redacted specialist posting to a forward base for a corporal who was administratively removed from active sniper operations 2 years ago. That's not a standard approval. No, she said. It isn't. He waited. She let the wait sit. There are people in the system who believe the Black Meridian outcome was wrong, she said finally. Not many. Enough. Hale folded his hands on the table. He had the hands of someone who had spent decades working, not soft, not decorative, genuinely used. The documents reference 3 individuals by designation, he said. Not by name. Designations consistent with senior officer protocol. The coordination record shows that the intelligence used to plan Black Meridian was modified after the original analysis was complete. Targets changed. Coordinates altered. The modification was upstream of the operational level. He looked at her. Upstream of you. Yes, she said. And when the operation failed because it was built on altered intelligence, it didn't fail, she said. Hale stopped. The operation achieved its stated objective, Elise said. Her voice was even, controlled. The kind of control that comes from having said the true thing in your own head so many times that saying it out loud no longer costs what it used to. The target was eliminated. The mission was complete. What failed was the cover story. The altered intelligence was supposed to create a clean exit. The coordinates were changed so that the post-mission record would show deviation from the operational plan, which would make it look like an error at the execution level. She paused. Execution level is where I was. Hale was very still. They needed a reason for the operation to be questioned, she said. Questioned operations get reviewed. Reviewed operations get their intelligence re-examined. If the intelligence gets re-examined, whoever altered it has a problem. So they needed the review to stop at a different level. She held his gaze. They stopped it at me. The room was quiet enough that the ventilation system was audible. Hale looked at her for a long time with the expression of someone who has just had a complex picture reorganized into a shape that is both clearer and worse than what it was before. How much of this can you document? He said. The materials from this morning's target site are a start. I have additional records. Some of it is, she considered her words, obtained through methods that will require their own explanation. But the content is accurate. Where are these records? Secure. Corporal. General. She said it quietly, not as a challenge, but as a boundary. I've spent 2 years watching what happens when the wrong people get access to information that threatens them. I'm not being difficult. I'm being careful. There's a difference. He looked at her. And in that look, 2 stars, 28 years of service, a man who had read enough files and sat across from enough people to know the difference between someone manufacturing a grievance and someone carrying a genuine one. Something shifted. He leaned back. All right, he said, we'll do this carefully. That's all I've ever asked, she said. What? She left the briefing room at 1842 hours and walked back toward the eastern perimeter in the cooling dark, the desert finally releasing some of what it had absorbed through the day, the temperature dropping in the way it only does in truly arid environments, fast, nearly sudden, like someone had adjusted a dial. The stars were coming out. She stood at the perimeter wall where she had sat that morning and looked out at the eastern ridge, a dark mass against a sky that was shifting from deep orange at the horizon to black overhead. The target position was invisible from here. She knew its coordinates precisely. She thought about Hale's face when she'd explained what Black Meridian actually was. She thought about the documents on that hard drive and what else they might contain. She thought about the 3 designations Hale had referenced, senior officer protocol. And she thought about the people those designations represented, who had spent 2 years being comfortable, who had built comfort on the assumption that the story was settled, and the witness had been effectively silenced. Behind her, she heard boots on sand. She didn't turn. You should be inside, she said. Probably, said Okafor. He stopped a few feet to her left and looked out at the same ridge. I told Briggs you were real, he said. This morning, before the alert. When he was still, he stopped. I told him the way you handled that rifle wasn't someone who didn't know what they were doing. What did he say? He told me to mind my sector. She almost smiled. Almost. He wasn't wrong about that, she said. They stood there in the quiet for a minute, the bass noise behind them, the desert dark in front. Corporal Vance, Okafor said. Ghost Viper. What does it mean? Where did it come from? She considered not answering. It was assigned after my 3rd confirmed long-range engagement, she said. The conditions on the 3rd one were bad enough that the observer said the shot came out of nowhere, like something invisible. She paused. The Viper part was less complimentary, originally. Okafor almost laughed, caught himself. Who assigned it? A man named Carver, chief warrant officer, good spotter, better person. She looked at the ridge. He testified on my behalf during the Black Meridian review. 2 weeks after his testimony, he was reassigned to a posting so remote it effectively ended his career. The quiet that followed that sentence had a different weight to it. Okafor absorbed it without filling it. Good. She had no use for people who rushed to fill silence with things that didn't help. Get some sleep, she said. Tomorrow will be its own problem. She heard him leave. She stayed at the wall for another 20 minutes, looking at the ridge in the dark, thinking through the next sequence. Because there was always a next sequence, always another calculation to run, always another piece of information to collect and integrate and act on. The documents from the target site were in Hale's hands now. Whatever was on that laptop was going through analysis that she hadn't controlled and couldn't fully predict. That was acceptable. Some loss of control was part of the process. What mattered was that the process was moving. What mattered was that for the first time in 2 years, the truth was moving faster than the cover. She turned from the wall and walked back toward the base. 30 meters away, in the shadow between two equipment containers, a figure she hadn't seen stood with a cell phone in hand, not a military-issued device, a personal one, and typed a short message, 6 words. Then the figure disappeared into the dark, moving toward the barracks block, and the phone's screen went black. The message had already sent. The message had 6 words. Nobody on the base knew what they said. Nobody on the base knew who had sent them, or to whom, or what the receiving end of that transmission looked like. What room, what person, what level of the institutional structure that had been very comfortable for 2 years received those 6 words and began making calculations of their own. Elise didn't know about the message yet. She walked back to her bunk in the attached personnel quarters, a small room at the end of a corridor that she'd been given because nobody else wanted it, too close to the generator to sleep comfortably through the night. And she sat on the edge of the cot in the dark for a while without turning the light on. Her hands were steady. They were always steady. That wasn't composure. That was training overlaid on enough repetition that the body had simply stopped registering certain kinds of stress as stress. What she felt wasn't calm. It was something more complicated. The specific tension of someone who has set something in motion and now has to wait for it to develop, which is always harder than the setting in motion. She lay back on the cot without taking her boots off, stared at the ceiling, thought about Carver. Warren Carver had been the best spotter she'd ever worked with, not because his ranging was exceptional, though it was, but because he understood something that most spotters took years to learn and some never did, that the relationship between shooter and spotter was not hierarchical, it was collaborative, and the shot that mattered was the one they solved together. He'd been 41 when they'd last worked together. He'd had a daughter starting college that year and a habit of drinking terrible instant coffee from a thermos. He'd carried since his first deployment, and he'd laughed at things that weren't that funny. Because, he'd once told her, the alternative was letting the accumulation of everything get to you, and that accumulation would kill you slower and more certainly than anything downrange ever could. After his testimony on her behalf, he'd been assigned to a logistics coordination post in a location she'd eventually found by cross-referencing 3 separate administrative databases. She'd written him once. He'd written back once. A single paragraph, careful and brief in the way that people are careful and brief when they know their communications are being monitored. Don't stop. Whatever you're doing, don't stop. Some things should be on the record. She'd kept the letter. It was in the same waterproof case as the 47 pages of cross-referenced intelligence data, in a storage unit in a city 500 miles from here, keyed to a combination that lived only in her head. She closed her eyes. 0430 would come fast. It came at 0312 instead, with the emergency alarm. Not the base-wide klaxon, something more specific, the rapid triple tone that designated a command center emergency, which was different from a perimeter breach alert, and different again from a medical emergency, and which Elise had memorized along with every other signal protocol on the base during her first week here, because she memorized everything that might be operationally relevant, and some things that probably weren't. She was off the cot and had her boots on before the 3rd repetition finished. The corridor outside her room was already moving, figures in various states of readiness jogging toward the command building, a voice somewhere ahead giving directions that she couldn't fully make out. She fell in with the flow without asking questions. Questions came after you understood what you were walking into. The command center was crowded when she got there. Dressler was at the main display. Hale was beside him, which meant Hale had either not left for the night or had been pulled back, and given the time, probably the latter. Cavanaugh was at his terminal running something that had put a particular quality of controlled alarm on his face. Briggs was at the back of the room, still pulling his jacket on. On the main display was a satellite image, thermal overlay, recent capture, timestamp showing 11 minutes ago, of the approach roads to Fort Raven Ridge's eastern access route. There were vehicles on those roads, multiple vehicles, moving in a pattern that wasn't civilian. "What do we have?" Elise said. Dressler looked at her. Under other circumstances, he might have questioned why attached support personnel were making direct queries in his command center. Under these circumstances, he answered. 4 vehicles, approximately 12 to 14 kilometers out, moving on the Eastern Service Road, non-standard spacing. They're running staggered, which isn't how local civilian traffic moves on that road at 0300. Speed? 40 to 50 kilometers per hour, consistent across all 4. They're not rushing, she said. She moved to the display and looked at the image. The thermal signatures were clear enough. 4 heat sources consistent with vehicles, and inside or around each, smaller signatures that read as personnel. Dismounts ready, but not deployed. They're planning to stop before they reach effective observation range of the base. That's our read too, Cavanaugh said. Hale was watching her. Corporal. She turned. The timing, he said. 1 day after the Eastern Ridge engagement, after the recovered materials. Yes, sir. Is this connected? It wasn't quite a question. She looked back at the display. 4 vehicles, probably 6 to 8 personnel each. That's a significant force element for a reactive operation. You don't spin that up in 12 hours unless you had it pre-staged. She paused. Which means they were already here, or close, and something triggered the deployment. What kind of something? She didn't answer immediately, because the answer she was arriving at had implications that she needed to be certain of before she said them out loud in a room full of people. Someone on this base sent a communication after 1830 hours last night, she said. External device, not military issued. I saw it. I didn't see who. The room went very quiet. Dressler turned from the display. You saw a figure between the equipment containers on the east side. Handheld device, personal, backlit screen. I was at the perimeter wall. It was dark. I couldn't identify who. Dressler's expression moved through several things rapidly. Why didn't you report it immediately? Because I wasn't certain of what I was seeing, and reporting uncertainty in that context without more information would have told the wrong people that I'd seen something without giving us anything actionable. She held his gaze. I'm reporting it now because now we have context. Hale said, to no one in particular. Lock the base. Nobody in or out. Internal communications. I want everything on monitored channels only as of right now. Dressler was already moving. Cavanaugh was already on the radio. Elise looked at the 4 vehicles on the display. 12 kilometers. At their current speed, maybe 16 minutes before they stopped and went to dismount. After that, how long depended on what they were planning. A perimeter probe, a coordinated breach, a snatch operation targeting specific assets. She turned the thought over. 4 vehicles was too large for a covert extraction. It was too organized for opportunistic violence. It was sized for a problem that needed to be solved comprehensively. A location that needed to be hit in enough places simultaneously that the response couldn't seal every gap. Or it was sized to retrieve something, to retrieve the materials from the target site before they could be fully analyzed and transmitted up the chain. She looked at Cavanaugh. The hard drive from the exploitation team, the physical documents, where are they physically right now? Command evidence safe, in this building. Transmission status. What's been sent up the chain? Initial image set went up last night. The full encrypted content of the drive is still being worked. Our analyst is, he checked, 40% through the decryption queue. 40%. Which meant 60% of whatever was on that drive was still here, still unread, still vulnerable. They're not coming for us, Elise said. They're coming for the drive. The next 4 minutes were controlled chaos of a specific military variety. Not panic, but the kind of high-speed reorganization that happens when a unit that has been in maintenance mode has to shift to defensive posture faster than its systems were designed for. Dressler pushed out a perimeter alert, activated the quick reaction force, and got the duty officer coordinating with the guard posts. Hale was on a secure line to someone Elise couldn't identify, his voice low and precise and clearly accustomed to being believed. Briggs materialized at Elise's elbow. QRF is standing up, he said. 4-vehicle element. If they're military trained and they know our perimeter layout, they know the layout. He absorbed that. Insider information. Someone who's been here long enough to know where the gaps are. Briggs looked at the display. We have maybe 10 minutes before they're in position. Less, she said. They'll push a scout element forward on foot before the vehicles stop. Standard doctrine. She looked at the thermal overlay. They probably already have. She was right. Kavanaugh confirmed it 40 seconds later. OP4, the same observation post that had called her shot the previous morning, reported a thermal signature on foot moving through the eastern scrubland, well ahead of the vehicle element, moving with the deliberate low-profile pattern of a trained scout. One man, moving fast, heading toward the perimeter's eastern blind spot. The eastern blind spot that Elise had identified in her first week and documented in a note she'd given to Dressler, which Dressler had passed to the duty officer, which had apparently not been actioned because when she looked at the guard post rotation, she could see that the coverage gap was still exactly where it had been. She picked up the Barrett case. "Corporal?" Dressler's voice, sharp. She stopped. "Where are you going with that?" "Eastern perimeter, OP2. I need elevation and a line on the approach route. The QRF is 4 minutes from full deployment. The scout is going to be at the perimeter in 3. She held his gaze. "I can see him from OP2. Dressler looked at Hale. Hale said, "Let her go." She was out the door before Dressler could reconsider. None. OP2 was a raised platform on the southeastern corner of the perimeter, higher than OP1 and with a better angle on the eastern approach terrain because of a natural slope in the ground that created a sightline advantage you wouldn't know was there unless you'd walked the terrain carefully. She'd walked it on day 3. She took the steps to the platform in 2 strides, set the Barrett case down, and had the rifle out and configured in under 90 seconds. Bipod deployed, optics up, scope uncapped. She didn't need the full setup. She needed the glass. The night vision capability on the Schmidt and Bender was limited. It was a precision daylight scope, not built for low light work, but the ambient light from the stars and the quarter moon gave her enough to work with. She pressed her eye to the scope and swept the eastern terrain. Nothing. Nothing. Brush. Rocky ground. Nothing. Then, movement. A shape moving through the scrub in the low crawl pattern of someone who knew what they were doing. Too disciplined to be a civilian. Spacing his movements to the rhythms of the ambient sound, wind, a distant vehicle, the hum of the base's generator, using noise cover to mask his approach. Professional. She ranged him. 430 meters. Angle slightly downhill from her position. She keyed her radio. "Command Ghost Viper. I have a visual on the scout element. Single individual, 430 meters, eastern approach, moving toward the perimeter blind spot at grid." She gave the coordinates precisely, reading them off her mental map of the terrain. "He's trained, low crawl, noise disciplined. This isn't militia." Dressler's voice came back. "Can you stop him?" "Define stop." A pause. "Non-lethal if possible. He's a source." She looked at the figure through the scope. 430 meters, moving target, night conditions. A rifle designed for half-mile precision shooting rather than close-quarters interdiction. "I can't guarantee non-lethal at this distance in these conditions with this platform," she said. "If you want him stopped without risk of lethal outcome, you need someone on the ground to intercept before he reaches the wall. You have a 2-minute window." "QRF is 2 minutes, Colonel. Do you have someone who can move?" A shorter pause. "Briggs," Dressler said, and she could hear him turning to address the room. "Take 2 personnel, eastern approach, intercept." She heard Briggs acknowledge, heard the controlled urgency of people moving. She kept the scope on the figure. He was good. She gave him that. Whoever he was, he moved through the terrain with a confidence that came from training and repetition, reading the ground without hesitating, adjusting his path around obstacles without breaking his rhythm. He was maybe 90 seconds from the perimeter wall. Briggs wasn't going to make it in time, she calculated. A warning shot at this range in darkness carried its own risks. A round impacting near a trained operative in low crawl would produce one of 2 responses. Either he'd go to ground and stay there, or he'd accelerate and change pattern, which would make him harder to track and potentially more dangerous. Warning shots were a gamble whose outcome depended almost entirely on the individual's training and nerve, and she couldn't assess either from here. What she could do was give Briggs better information. "Command, the scout is going to reach the wall before your intercept team. He's moving faster than your QRF pace. Eastern blind spot is at the wall junction. Grid reference, Kilo 7. I need a light source at that location. Something to push him left or right, change his approach angle, give your intercept team a better convergence point." Kavanaugh's voice. "We can activate the security light on the eastern junction." "Do it now." The light came on, a harsh white floodlight mounted on the perimeter wall that Elise had noted was incorrectly aimed, pointing too far east to be effective as a deterrent, but which would, from the scout's perspective and angle, create an illuminated zone directly in his planned approach path. The figure stopped. She watched him assess the new information through the scope. 3 seconds of stillness. Then he began moving left, adjusting his approach angle to work around the illuminated zone. Moving left put him on a direct line with Briggs's intercept route. "Briggs, he's coming to you. Moving left of the light. Approximately." She tracked the figure's adjusted path and projected. 40 meters south of your current position. He doesn't know you're there. She heard Briggs breathing on the radio, running. "Copy." 20 seconds. Then, sounds of a brief, controlled collision. Not a gunfight, a physical intercept. The short, violent sounds of 2 trained people making contact in the dark, grunts and impact, and the clatter of equipment on hard ground. Then, "Raven Ridge Command, Briggs. We have him. 1 individual detained, no shots fired." The collective exhale in the command center was audible through the radio. Elise kept the scope on the eastern terrain for another 30 seconds, confirming no secondary element she'd missed. Then she lifted her eye from the glass and looked out at the dark desert with her naked eyes, which gave her less detail and more context. The 4 vehicles were out there, still moving, not yet aware that their scout had been taken. They would be. The timeline was now different. What? She was back in the command center in 4 minutes. The detained scout was being moved to a secure holding space. Dressler had designated a room in the administrative block and posted 2 guards. The QRF was fully deployed now, positioned at the perimeter in a defensive configuration that covered the likely vehicle approach routes. Hale was still on the secure line when she came in. He finished his call, set the handset down, and looked at the room. "Air asset is 40 minutes out," he said. "Armed UAV. Until then, we hold what we have and we do not provoke a confrontation we can't finish." "The vehicles will stop when they lose communication with the scout," Dressler said. "They'll know something went wrong." "Probably." Hale looked at the display. The 4 vehicles had in fact slowed, the thermal signatures showing a reduction in speed that suggested exactly the reassessment Dressler was describing. "Question is whether they abort or adapt." "Depends on how important the objective is," Elise said. Both men looked at her. "If they're here for the drive," she said, "they can't abort. Not completely. The material on it is—" She stopped, because she was about to say something that would require explaining how she knew it, and that explanation was not something she could give cleanly in a room full of people at 0330 in the morning. "The material is significant enough that leaving without it creates exposure they can't accept." "How do you know what's on the drive?" Dressler said. "I know what the target was carrying in terms of network function. I know what a node at his level would have access to." She met Dressler's eyes. "It's inferential, but it's sound inference." He held her gaze for a moment, and she could see him deciding whether to push on it. He didn't. Hale said, "If they adapt, what does adaptation look like?" "They split the element," she said. 2 vehicles create a distraction. Noise, visible presence, draw your QRF to the approach route. 2 vehicles go to secondary entry. "What are your secondary entry vulnerabilities?" Dressler looked at his duty officer. The duty officer, a lieutenant named Marsh who had been running on adrenaline for the past 20 minutes, pulled up the base schematic. "Service gate on the northwestern corner. It's—" He stopped. "It's on reduced staffing tonight. Personnel rotation issue, 2 guards instead of 4. "That's your secondary," Elise said. Dressler was already issuing the redeployment order. 2 additional personnel to the northwestern gate, full alert, no vehicle access until the situation resolved. Elise looked at the display. The 4 vehicles had stopped. For 90 seconds, they sat motionless on the eastern service road, heat signatures static, and she imagined the conversation happening inside those vehicles, the reassessment, the new calculation, the decision about whether the objective justified the now higher cost. Then 2 of the vehicles began moving, not toward the eastern approach. They turned, headed northwest. "There it is," Briggs said from the back of the room. "Northwestern gate, they're inbound," Dressler said into the radio. "Hold position, do not allow access, weapons free on confirmed hostile action only." The remaining 2 vehicles stayed on the eastern road, not moving forward, staying in position, engines running. A standoff, not a firefight. A standoff, which was better and worse simultaneously. Better because nobody was shooting. Worse because standoffs had their own logic, and that logic sometimes produced outcomes that a firefight wouldn't. The secure line on the wall activated. Kavanaugh answered it, listened for 5 seconds, then turned with an expression that Elise had not seen on his face before. "Sir, it's for Corporal Vance." Every head in the room turned. Secure channel, authenticated military encryption, the caller ID routes to a classification level above base access. Kavanaugh looked at the handset like it had developed a personality he wasn't sure about. "They're asking for Ghost Viper specifically, by call sign." The room was completely silent. Dressler looked at Elise. She crossed the room, took the handset from Kavanaugh. "This is Ghost Viper," she said. A pause. Then a voice she recognized. Not because she knew the person well, because she knew the voice from a single conversation 3 years ago, in a room with no windows, before Black Meridian, before everything. A conversation that had been brief and had ended with a statement that she had stored in a specific part of her memory, reserved for things that might become important later. If you ever find something that needs to go above the system, there's a way. You'll know when. She'd known back then that it wasn't a real offer, that it was the kind of thing people in positions of oversight said to field operators to maintain a particular kind of trust relationship. She'd filed it and moved on. She was less certain it wasn't real now. "You've had a productive day," the voice said. "Yes." The materials from the site, the drive content, what's been transmitted to central analysis has created significant attention. A pause. "The vehicles outside your perimeter are a reaction to that attention." "I know." "They won't breach. They've been told the air asset timeline. They're communicating with someone who has accurate information about your defensive status." She looked at the room around her. Dressler, Hale, Kavanaugh, Briggs, Marsh, the duty staff. "Someone in this building," she said. "Someone who received a communication last night and made a decision that seemed manageable at the time." Another pause. "The scout you detained. He's carrying a device. Secondary compartment in the left boot heel. The content of that device is going to accelerate what happens next significantly." "Who are you?" she said. A pause longer than the others. "Someone who's been watching the Black Meridian file for 2 years. Someone who couldn't move on it without corroborating material." The voice was even. Not apologetic, not dramatic, just precise. "You've provided the corroborating material." Elise stood with the handset pressed to her ear and said nothing for 3 full seconds. "The 3 designations in the coordination record," she said. "You know who they are?" "Yes." "So do I," she said. "I've known for 8 months. I've been building the documentation to make it stick." Silence from the other end. Then, "How complete is your documentation?" 70%. "The remaining 30 is what's on that drive." Another silence. Longer. "Then finish it," the voice said. "You'll have cover from this end for the next 72 hours. After that, the window closes, and whatever isn't on the record won't make it onto the record." The line went dead. She held the handset for a moment, set it down, turned to face the room. Hale was watching her with the steady attention of a man who had heard one side of a conversation and was now performing a rapid and sophisticated assessment of what it implied. "Corporal," he said, "what was that?" She looked at him, then at Dressler, then at Briggs. Then she looked at each face in the room in sequence, quickly and without making a production of it, the kind of look you give a space when you're assessing it for something specific. "The scout," she said. "Left boot, secondary compartment in the heel. Get it before anyone else does." Dressler stared at her. "What?" "Now, Colonel, please." Something in her voice moved him. He turned to Marsh. "Go, now." Marsh went. Elise stood in the middle of the command center with the display showing the standoff outside, the 2 eastern vehicles holding position, the 2 northwestern vehicles now stopped 300 meters from the gate, everyone waiting for something. And she ran the calculation that she'd been running in the back of her mind since the phone call ended. 72 hours. 30% of the documentation still locked on the drive. 1 person in this room who had sent 6 words to the vehicles outside last night. And 3 people, behind their designation codes, who had spent 2 years believing they'd successfully buried a woman and a truth, and who were now learning, at 03:47 in the morning, that they had been wrong about both. She breathed out slowly. The calculation was solvable. It was always solvable. You just had to collect the information. Outside, the UAV was 32 minutes out, and the vehicles on both approach roads sat with their engines running in the dark desert, and somewhere in the administrative block. A soldier named Marsh was moving fast toward a room where a detained scout lay with a secret in the heel of his left boot. And in the command center, 4 minutes after Marsh left, General Hale's phone rang. He looked at the screen. His face did something that Elise had not seen it do in the hours she'd been observing him. A brief, involuntary tightening around the jaw, gone almost before it registered. He answered, listened for 12 seconds, said, "I understand," hung up. Looked at Elise with an expression that had shed its careful neutrality and replaced it with something considerably more direct. "There's a problem," he said. "Tell me." "The 3 designations in the coordination record." He paused. "One of them is currently on a plane, inbound to this region, ETA 11 hours. Another pause. "He has authority to pull the Black Meridian file from any ongoing review process and reclassify it at a level that would make the contents inaccessible for the foreseeable future." The room held its breath. Elise looked at the clock on the wall. 3:51 hours. 11 hours. She looked at the display. The vehicles outside, the standoff, the UAV 31 minutes out. And she mapped the new timeline against what she had and what she still needed. And the calculation was tighter than she would have chosen, but it was not impossible. Nothing was impossible. You just had to find the information. "Then we have 11 hours, she said. 11 hours was both enough and not enough, depending entirely on what happened in the first 2. Elise understood this the way she understood ballistic problems. Not as an abstraction, but as a set of concrete variables that needed to be worked in the right sequence. You didn't solve a 3,800-meter shot by thinking about the target. You solved it by working backward from the target, to the conditions, to the platform, to the shooter, identifying every variable in that chain and addressing each one in order. Skip 1, the whole solution collapsed. Same principle applied here. "The drive," she said. "How much of the decryption queue can your analyst finish in 2 hours? Kavanaugh checked. "At current pace, maybe 65–70% total." "What's the bottleneck?" "The encryption protocol is layered. Each successive layer uses a different key architecture. He's been working the layers sequentially." "Can he run parallel decryption on the outer layers while the inner content extracts?" Kavanaugh looked uncertain. I'd have to ask him." "Ask him now." Kavanaugh got on the internal line. Elise turned to Hale. "The device in the scout's boot," she said. "When Marsh brings it, I need to be the first person who looks at it." "Why?" "Because I know what I'm looking for and your analyst doesn't. Not yet." Hale studied her. "You've seen this type of device before." "I've seen what it communicates with. The encryption schema is the same one the network has been using for 14 months. I documented it." She held his gaze. "It's in the records I told you about, the ones in secure storage. The records you obtained through methods that will require their own explanation." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm going to need those records, Corporal. All of them, before this morning is over." "I know." "And the explanation?" "Yes." "Is the explanation going to give me problems?" She considered being diplomatic, decided against it. "Some of it will," she said. "The content is accurate. The methodology is unconventional." Hale looked at the ceiling briefly, the gesture of a man adding an item to a list that was already longer than he wanted. "Fine," he said. "We deal with that when we get to it." Marsh came back through the door moving fast, holding a small evidence bag with a device inside. Slim, matte black, roughly the size and shape of a USB drive but thicker, with no visible ports or markings. He handed it to Elise. She turned it over in her fingers, felt along the edges for the activation point. A pressure-sensitive depression that wouldn't be visible by design. Found it. Applied 15 pounds of pressure with her thumbnail. Nothing happened, which was correct. The device needed a specific paired unlock sequence, not just activation pressure. But the pressure confirmed it was powered. The internal battery was live. "This is a data relay device," she said. "Military-adjacent manufacture, so not standard issue anywhere, but the architecture is based on a SOCOM communications platform that was discontinued 4 years ago and then apparently not discontinued in certain circles." She set it on the nearest flat surface carefully. It's been transmitting since he was detained. Encrypted burst protocol, probably 30-second intervals. Whoever is receiving knows he's been captured and stationary for, she checked the clock, 41 minutes. Can we block the transmission? Dressler said. You'd need to know the frequency band. Your signals team might be able to jam the entire spectrum in that range, but that kills your own communications. So we can't stop it. We can use it, she said. Dressler and Hale both looked at her. If the receiver knows he's stationary and captured, they know the operation is compromised. They're waiting to see what we do next. Whether we move him, whether we change our defensive posture, whether we transmit anything that tells them what we've found. She picked the device up again. What we transmit is our choice. Hale's expression shifted into something that was almost appreciation. You want to feed them false information? I want to feed them information that buys us time. Specifically, information that suggests the boot compartment wasn't found, that the detained individual is being held in standard processing and hasn't been searched below the ankle. And while they're operating on that assumption, we finish the drive decryption and get what we need on the record before the plane lands. The room absorbed this. Briggs at the back said, "And the person in this room who sent the message last night?" Everyone went still in a different way than before. Not the stillness of people processing information, but the stillness of people suddenly aware of each other. Elise said nothing. She looked at the device in her hand. Hale said, "That gets addressed, but not right now, and not like this." His voice carried the specific authority of someone who has decided that a particular problem needs to be handled in a particular way and is not opening the floor to alternative suggestions. Right now, we work the timeline. Everything else follows. The next 90 minutes were the kind that leave marks. The analyst, a staff sergeant named Petrov, who had been pulled from his bunk at U-345 and had arrived at his terminal still pulling on his shirt, ran the parallel decryption approach that Elise suggested and confirmed it worked, cutting his estimated completion time from 4 hours to 90 minutes at the cost of some processor stability that he managed by babysitting the terminal personally and catching 2 near crashes before they cascaded. The vehicles outside held their positions. The 2 on the eastern road stayed stationary after the UAV arrived on station at 0428 and began making lazy orbits at altitude, visible to anyone with eyes, unmistakably armed, sending a message that required no translation. The 2 northwestern vehicles withdrew 17 minutes after the UAV arrived, reversing back down the service road at a pace that communicated calculation rather than panic. Dressler watched them go on the thermal display. "They're not done," he said. "No," Elise agreed. "They're resetting. They know the timeline on the inbound aircraft. They're working to a different plan now." "Which is?" "Make sure the file gets reclassified before the drive content reaches anyone who can act on it." She looked at the clock. "Which means interfering with the transmission chain, not the base." Dressler looked at Hale. Hale was already on the secure line again. "Oh." At 0531, Petrov looked up from his terminal with the specific expression of someone who has found something they weren't prepared for. "Corporal Vance," he said, "you should look at this." She crossed the room and stood behind him. The screen showed a document tree, the decrypted file structure from the target's hard drive, organized by date and designation. Most of it she'd expected. Communication logs, coordination records, financial transfer documentation of the kind that networks use to move operational funding through layers of legitimacy. Then a folder near the bottom of the structure, labeled with a date from 31 months ago, 4 days before Operation Black Meridian. She pulled up a chair, sat beside Petrov, and opened the folder. There were 11 documents inside. The first 3 were planning records, operational parameters, intelligence summaries, target packages. She scanned them quickly and moved to the 4th, which was an internal communication marked with a designation she recognized from the coordination record Hale had shown her. She read the 4th document. Then she read it again, more slowly. Then she sat back in the chair and put both hands flat on the table in front of her and breathed through her nose for 3 seconds. "Petrov," she said, "print everything in this folder. 2 copies, physical paper, right now." "The printer is, find it and use it. Now." He found it, used it. While the printer ran, she read the remaining 7 documents in the folder. By the time she finished the last one, the printed copies were in her hands, still warm, and the full picture that she had been assembling for 8 months. The picture that had been missing its center, the piece that explained not just what had happened but why and who had decided it should happen that way, was finally complete. The why was money. It was almost always money in the end. Not exclusively. There was also the kind of institutional self-protection that becomes indistinguishable from corruption over time. The accumulated decisions of people who had made one wrong choice and then made 10 more trying to contain the first. But at the core of Operation Black Meridian, underneath the altered intelligence and the falsified coordinates and the career destruction of Elise Vance, was a financial arrangement between 3 senior officers and a network of non-state actors that had been running for 4 years before the operation ever happened. Black Meridian had been designed to eliminate a node that knew about the arrangement. The intelligence was altered not to frame Elise for a missed shot. It was altered to ensure the operation produced a clean kill without leaving documentation that would connect the target to his handlers on the American side. The coordinates were changed to route the approach through a specific terrain feature that would have destroyed the post-mission evidence package in what would have looked like an environmental accident. She had deviated from the altered coordinates because the terrain read wrong to her. She'd gone to her own ranging and her own judgment and hit the actual target at the actual location, which was the right location, which was not the location in the falsified record. And then the people who had falsified the record had realized that the evidence package was intact, the body was at the wrong coordinates, and the only explanation for the deviation was the operator on the trigger, so they'd made her the explanation. She sat with the documents in her hands and felt the specific sensation of having a thing confirmed that you have known for a long time but could not prove. The sensation that is not satisfaction and is not relief, but is something between the two, complicated by the cost of the 2 years it took to get here. Carver's letter. Don't stop. Whatever you're doing, don't stop. She stood up, took both sets of printed documents to Hale, who was still in the command center, and set them in front of him without preamble. Read the 4th document first, she said, then 7 through 11. He read. She watched his face while he read, which was not something she did out of satisfaction, but out of necessity. She needed to calibrate his response before she made her next move, and his response to what was in those pages would tell her things about how much operational support she was actually working with. What his face did was controlled, and then, briefly, not. The not controlled moment lasted about 4 seconds. Then he locked it back down with the discipline of someone who has long practice at not showing reactions in rooms full of subordinates. He set the documents down. Looked up at her. You've known the outline of this for 8 months, he said. The outline. Not the documents. The documents are the proof. And the 3 designations. He tapped the 4th document where the designations appeared in the communication header. You said you know who they are. Yes. Tell me. She told him. He didn't react visibly to the first name, or the second. On the 3rd, something moved very briefly through his expression. Not surprise precisely, more like the confirmation of a suspicion he had been carrying without acknowledging. The inbound aircraft, she said. That's him. Yes. He knows what's on the drive. He has to assume it. The timing of the vehicle deployment tells him the site was exploited and the materials were recovered. He'll have been briefed on everything his network here could tell him. Hale picked up the documents again, straightened them, set them down. The small organizational gestures of a man who needed his hands to be doing something while his mind ran ahead. If he lands and invokes his authority to reclassify, he can't reclassify physical printed documents that are already in the hands of a 2-star with witness, Elise said. He can reclassify digital files. He can block transmissions. He can put holds on database access. She met Hale's eyes. He cannot walk into this command center and take paper out of your hands. Hale looked at the documents, looked at her. No, he said slowly. He can't. So we transmit what we can in the window we have, and we keep physical copies of everything, and we make sure the physical copies are in the right hands before that plane lands. The right hands being yours, and whoever you call in the next hour. He held her gaze for a long moment. She could see him working through it. The institutional weight of what she was proposing, the career implications, the fact that the person on that inbound aircraft outranked him and had connections that extended well above both of them, and the counterweight of 11 documents that laid out, in the plain language of people who had been certain they'd never be read by the wrong eyes, exactly what had been done and why and to whom. I need to make some calls, he said. Yes, sir. This is going to be a significant day. It already has been, she said. At 07.4, with 4 hours and 20 minutes remaining before the projected aircraft arrival, Dressler found Elise in the corridor outside the command center and told her that the detained scout was asking to speak with her specifically. She stopped. By name? By call sign, Dressler said. He said Ghost Viper, and he said... Dressler paused, looking faintly like a man delivering a message he didn't entirely understand. He said he has something that belongs to you. She went to the holding room. It was a standard administrative room converted to a detention space, 2 guards outside, furniture reduced to a table and 2 chairs, the single window covered. The scout was sitting at the table with his wrists zip-tied in front of him, which was standard processing. He was younger than she'd expected, mid-30s, lean, with the kind of face that had been outdoors in hard conditions long enough to look older in the eyes than in the jaw. He looked at her when she came in, and his expression was complicated. You made the shot yesterday, he said. His English was clean, American inflected. She sat across from him. The guard stayed outside. Yes, she said. I watched it through a spotting scope from the northwestern ridge. He shifted in the chair. I've been in the field for 11 years. I've never seen that distance in those conditions. What do you have that belongs to me? He looked at her for a moment. I was there, he said, when they testified against you. I was support staff for the review panel. I wasn't cleared for the content. I ran communications logistics, but I heard enough. She said nothing. Her hands were flat on the table. The man you shot yesterday, he said. How was the one who physically altered the coordinates in the operational record? I saw him do it. I didn't understand what I was seeing at the time. I was 24. He paused. I've understood it for about 6 years. And you've been working for the network that sent you here. I've been working inside it. That's different. She looked at him steadily. Is it? He met her eyes. I have a testimony. Written, witnessed. What I saw during the Black Meridian review process, and what I saw 6 years ago when I finally understood what the coordinate alteration meant. He looked at his hands, the zip ties. I've been trying to get it to someone who could use it for a long time. The network monitors everything. There was no clean path. He looked back at her. Last night, someone told me Ghost Viper was here, at this base, and I made a decision. The room was quiet. You let yourself get caught, she said. I positioned myself to be intercepted. There's a difference. She stared at him. The testimony, she said. Where is it? Memorized. I'll give it to whoever needs to hear it, on record, under oath. He paused. I'll accept whatever comes with that. She thought about Carver, about a man who had told the truth in a formal proceeding and had his career quietly destroyed as a consequence, about the cost of doing the right thing when the wrong people had more institutional weight than the right ones. She thought about 11 hours having become 7, and 7 being enough if the pieces were in place. I'm going to send someone in here with a recording device, she said. You're going to give the testimony completely. Everything you saw, everything you understood, in sequence, with dates and locations to the best of your memory. Yes, and then it goes on the record, physical and digital. It becomes part of a package that will be in the hands of people who can act on it before a specific aircraft lands this morning. Yes. She looked at him for a moment longer. What's your name? Reyes, Daniel Reyes. Why Ghost Viper specifically, Reyes? Why did it have to be me? He looked at the table, then back at her. Because you were the one they burned, he said. Because the testimony means more from someone who was there and from someone who was harmed by the same event corroborating each other than from either one alone. He paused. And because I've been watching the Black Meridian file for 3 years, waiting for someone to start pulling at it from the inside, and you were the only one who did. She stood up, looked at him for one more second, then walked to the door, opened it, and told one of the guards to get her a recorder sound. By 0900, the testimony was recorded, transcribed by Kavanaugh, working at a pace that aged him visibly, and incorporated into the physical document package that Hale had spent the past 2 hours building with the methodical precision of someone who understood that the architecture of a formal record was as important as its content. The wrong organization, the wrong sequence, a gap in the chain of custody. Any of those could provide an exit point for the kind of legal maneuvering that people with resources and motive would absolutely attempt. Hale had been in the military for 31 years. He knew how records got attacked. He built this one to survive the attack. At 0922, he transmitted a compressed summary package, not the full documents, but a structured abstract sufficient to establish the factual record, to 4 separate recipients through the secure channel. He told Elise who 2 of them were. He did not tell her who the other 2 were, and she did not ask, because the specific knowledge of where certain information had gone was sometimes more dangerous than the information itself. At 0947, Dressler identified the person who had sent the 6-word message the previous evening. It was not a dramatic revelation. There was no confrontation, no raised voices, no moment of theatrical exposure. It was Dressler, sitting at a terminal, cross-referencing the base's internal movement logs with the timeline of personal device activity flagged by the communications lockdown Hale had ordered, arriving at a name with the quiet certainty of someone completing a subtraction problem. The name was Warrant Officer First Class Glenn Tabor, 38 years old, 7 years at various postings within the same regional command structure. I was in the motor pool when Dressler found him. He didn't run. He didn't argue. He sat down on the hood of a vehicle and put his hands on his knees and looked at the ground with the expression of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has finally set it down in the worst possible place. "How long?" Dressler said. Tabor looked up. 4 years. They had leverage? A pause. At the beginning. After a while, he stopped. After a while, it wasn't about the leverage anymore. Dressler had him taken to the same administrative block where Reyes was being held, in a separate room, and posted guards, and walked back to the command center with the expression of a man who has confirmed something he wished weren't true. At 1104, with the inbound aircraft 50 minutes from landing at the regional airfield 2 hours' drive from Fort Raven Ridge, Hale's secure line rang. He answered, listened for 40 seconds. His face remained neutral throughout. He hung up, turned to the room. "The aircraft has been diverted," he said, "by order of the Inspector General's office. The passenger is being met at the diversion airfield by a legal team." He paused. "The IG opened a formal inquiry 7 minutes ago based on the summary package I transmitted this morning." The command center was quiet. Then Kavanaugh said very quietly, "Sir, all 3 designations?" "The inquiry covers all 3, Hale said. "It covers the Black Meridian operational record, the post-mission review process, and any associated administrative actions connected to the operation." Administrative actions. The phrase that covered, in institutional language, what had been done to Elise Vance's career. She was standing near the back of the room. She had been there for the last hour, not because there was anything specific for her to do, but because leaving had felt wrong. This room was where the pieces had come together, where the morning had been fought and the record had been built, and some part of her needed to be present for whatever the morning became. She heard Hale's words. She didn't move. Briggs was 2 meters to her left. He looked at her sideways without making a production of it. She didn't look back. She was thinking about Carver, about a paragraph in a letter written carefully because the writer knew he was being watched, about a man sitting in a logistics coordination post in a location she'd eventually found through 3 cross-reference databases, doing work that bore no resemblance to what he'd been built for, because he'd told the truth in a room full of people who needed him not to. She was going to need to make a call, not now, but soon. "Corporal Vance." She looked up. Hale had crossed the room to her. He was holding the physical document package, the printed copies of the drive content, the transcribed testimony, the chain of custody records he'd built with such careful architecture. He held it out to her. She looked at it. "That needs to stay with you, sir." "I've kept copies. These are yours." She took the package. It was heavier than it looked, which was a function of the paper stock the printer used, but it felt heavier than that. "What happens now?" she said. "The IG investigation runs its course. That takes time, months, possibly longer. The legal process is not fast." He said it without apology. "But it's moving, and it's on the record in a way that can't be quietly reclassified." He looked at her. "You understand that the process from here is institutional. It's going to require patience." "I've been patient for 2 years." "You've been working for 2 years. That's different." He held her gaze. "From here you stop working and you let the process work. That's harder." She looked at the package in her hands. He was right. She knew he was right. The kind of person she was, the kind of person you had to be to spend 8 months building a 47-page cross-referenced intelligence dossier in a rented room while officially on administrative status, was not naturally suited to waiting while institutions moved at institutional pace. But the record was built. The documents were in the right hands. The testimony existed on tape and on paper and in a transmission that had already reached 4 recipients she could not recall even if someone asked her to. The machine was moving. "There's a chief warrant officer named Warren Carver," she said. "He testified on my behalf during the Black Meridian review. He was reassigned 2 weeks after his testimony." Hale nodded slowly. "I'll find him." His reassignment should be part of the administrative review. It was retaliatory. "I'll find him," Hale said again, with enough weight in it that she believed him. She looked down at the package in her hands. The desert outside was building toward its midday heat again. She could feel it in the quality of the air even inside the building, the slow accumulation of temperature that the base's ventilation system fought and gradually lost every afternoon. The same heat that had been working against her shot yesterday morning. The same variables she'd spent 6 weeks measuring and cataloging and learning. Every problem had a solution. Find the information. She tucked the package under her arm. "Thank you, sir," she said. Hale looked at her for a moment with something in his expression that wasn't quite warmth and wasn't quite professional regard, but was somewhere between the two, the look of someone who has seen a thing done well under conditions that made doing it well considerably harder than it should have been. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "The process is long and it's going to be uncomfortable and there will be days when it feels like nothing is moving." He paused. "But the record exists. That's what matters. The record exists and it's out of reach." She nodded, turned, walked toward the door of the command center, the package under her arm, and 2 years of accumulated weight somewhere behind her. Not gone, but different now. Not the weight of something unresolved, but the weight of something set in motion that she no longer had to carry alone. She pushed through the door. The heat hit her immediately, full and honest and indifferent, the desert doing what the desert always did. She stood in it for a moment. Then she walked toward the eastern perimeter, because that was where she thought best, and there was still thinking to do, and the sun was not going to wait for her to be ready. The eastern perimeter wall cast a strip of shadow that would be gone in 30 minutes. Elise sat in it anyway. The document package was beside her on the ground, weighted down by the Barrett case so the desert wind, which had picked up since morning, running northwest at about 8 knots now, consistent with the afternoon pattern she'd documented across 6 weeks, wouldn't take the pages somewhere inconvenient. She had her notebook open on her knee, but she wasn't writing in it. She was looking at the eastern ridge. The target position was invisible from here in daylight. She knew exactly where it was. She thought about the 4 years before Black Meridian, the operational record that had run clean and exceptional for 11 years. The missions that existed in redacted files and classified after-action reports that most people would never read, in locations that most people would never know she'd been. The work she had done, which was real and which had mattered, regardless of what 2 years of administrative destruction had tried to make of it. You couldn't retroactively undo a thing that was done. That was the permanent fact of completed action, and it cut both ways. They couldn't erase what she'd actually done any more than she could erase what they'd done to her. Both things existed on the record now. One of them had been on the record all along, buried under black bars. The other was going to stay buried until it wasn't. The IG investigation would take months. Hale had been honest about that, and she appreciated the honesty more than she would have appreciated false reassurance. Institutions moved at institutional pace, and the legal architecture of a case involving 3 senior officers with 4 decades of combined service and significant political adjacency was going to be complex and contested, and there would be days, probably many of them, when nothing appeared to be moving and the weight of it pressed down without any visible counterweight. She knew that. She was prepared for that in the way that you prepare for a long-distance shot in bad conditions. Not by eliminating the difficulty, but by accepting it as part of the problem, building it into the calculation from the beginning rather than being surprised by it when it arrived. What she was less prepared for, and what she was sitting with now in the narrowing strip of shadow, was the specific aftermath of having done the thing she came here to do. For 8 months, the mission had been clear. Find the documentation, reach an exploitable position, expose the network node, trigger the chain of evidence that would bring the Black Meridian record into the open. Every day had been organized around that structure. Every calculation had fed into it. Now the chain was triggered. The mission, in its primary sense, was complete. And she was sitting against a wall in the desert with a notebook open to a blank page, and the next thing had not yet revealed itself. And the absence of the next thing felt stranger than she'd expected. Her radio crackled. "Vance, Command Center," Kavanaugh's voice. She picked up the handset. "Go ahead." "General Hale is requesting your presence. He's got someone on a secure video link he wants you to speak with." She looked at the ridge for one more second. "On my way." The secure video terminal in the command center's back room was a system she hadn't used before, military-grade encrypted, the kind of setup that required 3 authentication steps, and produced an image quality that was functional rather than clear, a slight compression artifact that made faces look slightly flatter than they were. Hale was standing to one side of the terminal when she came in. He looked at her and then at the screen, and the expression on his face was one she couldn't immediately categorize. She looked at the screen. Warren Carver looked older. Not dramatically older. 2 years wasn't long enough for that. But the specific kind of older that accumulates not from time, but from circumstances. From doing work that doesn't use you correctly. From the low-grade erosion of being somewhere that isn't where you're supposed to be. He had more gray at the temples than she remembered, and he was sitting in what looked like a government-issue office chair in a room with institutional beige walls. And he was looking at her through the compression artifact with an expression that she recognized because she had the same one. The expression of someone who has been waiting for a specific thing for long enough that when it arrives, the first response is not relief, but the strange, disorienting reality of no longer waiting. "Vance," he said. "Carver." A pause. The video link had a half-second delay that made natural conversation slightly awkward, the way transatlantic calls used to be before the technology caught up. "Hale found you fast," she said. "I wasn't hiding." A brief, tired version of his old laugh. "I was in a logistics coordination office in the most boring posting in the continental United States. I've been waiting for someone to come find me for about 18 months. You got my letter." "I got your letter." Another pause. "The IG inquiry," she said. "You'll be contacted. Your testimony from the Black Meridian Review, the original testimony. It's part of the record now. They'll want the corroborating account." "I know. Hale briefed me." Carver shifted in his chair. "I've been ready for that conversation for 2 years. I have notes. I kept notes on everything. Dates, names, what was said in the room, what changed between my pre-testimony briefing and the actual record that was filed." He paused. "They told me my testimony was incorporated accurately. I found out 8 months later that 2 key statements had been summarized in ways that changed their meaning." "I know," she said. "It's in the documents." He looked at her through the screen. "You got the documents?" "Yesterday." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "How?" "The network was running a node through the Eastern Transit Corridor near my current posting." She paused. "I've been here 6 weeks." Carver looked at the ceiling briefly. The gesture she remembered, the one he made when he was processing something that had multiple moving parts and needed a second to organize them. "You set yourself up," he said. "You waited for the node to come through range." "Yes." "That's—" He stopped. "That's a long game." It was the right game. He looked back at her. "What was the distance?" She knew what he was asking. 3850, she said. "Heat bloom, variable wind, 103 degrees. Carver was quiet for 3 full seconds. "I'd have called that unworkable," he said. "I know." "It wasn't unworkable." "No." Another pause, longer than the video delay accounted for. "I should have pushed harder," he said, "after the testimony. When I knew what they'd done with my statements, I should have—" "Carver." He stopped. "You told the truth in a formal proceeding under circumstances where the truth was not what the proceeding was designed to find," she said. "And then you wrote me 1 paragraph in a letter that told me not to stop. That paragraph was worth more than you know." She held his gaze through the compression artifact. "You did your part. The rest was mine to do." He looked at her for a moment. "How are you?" he said. Not as a formality, the actual question. She considered it honestly. "Working on it," she said. He nodded. Once, slowly. The nod of someone who understands that answer completely and doesn't require it to be more than it is. Call me when the inquiry contacts you, she said. If you need anything, documentation, corroboration on the timeline, I have it. I will. She looked at him for one more second. Good to see you, Carver. Yeah. He almost smiled. Good to see you too, Ghost Viper. She reached forward and ended the connection. Stood in the small room with the blank screen for a moment. Then she walked back out into the command center, where the day's work was still running. Kavanaugh at his terminal, Petrov finishing the last of the decryption queue, Marsh coordinating the formal processing of the two detained individuals with the efficiency of someone grateful to have a procedural task that didn't require judgment calls. Hale was at the main display, looking at a map that was no longer showing thermal signatures of vehicles. The eastern service road was empty. The northwestern approach was empty. Fort Raven Ridge looked on the display like a base in standby, which was, for the first time in 24 hours, approximately accurate. How is he? Hale said, without turning from the map. Intact, she said. Ready. Good. He turned. There's something else. I've been on the phone with the regional JAG office this morning. The administrative finding from the Black Meridian Review. The formal removal from active sniper operations. Given the evidence in the document package and Reyes's testimony, the JAG's preliminary assessment is that the finding was procedurally compromised. She waited. They're not going to reverse it today, he said. The full reversal is part of the IG process, and that has its own timeline, but he paused, choosing his next words. The administrative restriction on your operational status has been suspended pending the inquiry outcome. As of this morning, you're no longer listed as attached personnel, specialist services. She looked at him. What am I listed as? Ghost Viper, he said. Reinstated call sign. Active operational status. He held her gaze. It's not the full reversal. The full reversal takes time. But it's on the record. Your operational status is restored while the process runs. She stood in the middle of the command center and felt the weight of that land. Not the triumph of it. She'd been right to distrust easy triumph, and nothing about the past 24 hours had been easy enough to celebrate cleanly. But the fact of it, the plain, documented, formally recorded fact that Elise Vance existed again in the military record as what she actually was, rather than what 2 years of institutional violence had tried to make her. It wasn't the same as justice. Justice was a longer process, and she was honest enough with herself to know she didn't entirely trust it yet. But it was real. It was on the record, and the record was out of reach. Thank you, sir, she said. Hale looked at her with that expression again, the one between warmth and professional regard, and nodded once. Oh. She found Briggs in the motor pool at Thunder 300 hours, running what looked like an entirely unnecessary inspection of a vehicle that was clearly in adequate condition, which she recognized as the thing people do when they need to be doing something physical while they think. She stopped a few feet away. He looked up. They regarded each other for a moment with the specific quality of two people who have arrived at a mutual understanding through a route that neither of them would have chosen. Heard about the operational status, he said. Word travels. It's a small base. He set down whatever tool he was holding. I owe you a different conversation than the ones I've been having for the past 2 weeks. You don't owe me anything, she said. You operated on the information you had. I operated on assumptions I hadn't tested. Same thing, most of the time. He looked at her. Not for someone at my level. I should know better than to assume. He paused. I did know better. I just didn't apply it. She held his gaze. He wasn't performing contrition. She'd have dismissed that. He was doing something harder, which was being accurate about himself without making the accuracy into a way of centering himself in a situation that wasn't about him. You got the scout intercepted, she said. Your team moved fast and they moved right, and they did it without shots fired. That matters. He nodded, accepting it for what it was rather than more. The Barrett, he said, 3850. I've been thinking about it since yesterday morning, and I still can't fully work out the solution in my head. The wind variance alone, I had 6 weeks of environmental data, she said. I'd been tracking the thermal cycle on that ridge every day since I arrived. The wind pattern at that exposure has a consistent gust interval that I'd measured to within 40 seconds of accuracy. She paused. It looked like a single shot. It was 6 weeks of preparation. Briggs looked at her. That's not how most people would describe their methodology, he said. Most people haven't had 2 years to think about what they'd do differently if they got another chance. He was quiet for a moment. If the IG process goes the way it should, he said carefully. If your record gets fully restored, are you going back to active operations? She thought about it, genuinely thought, not the reflexive kind. I don't know yet, she said. Ask me in 6 months. He nodded. That was an honest answer, and he received it as one. She turned to leave. Vance. She looked back. For what it's worth, he said, the people on this base, the ones who wrote you off, who laughed, who assumed, they're not bad soldiers. They just made assumptions they hadn't tested, she said. He almost smiled. Yeah. I know, she said. That's the part I'm not angry about. She walked out of the motor pool into the afternoon sun. Okafor found her at 1500 hours. She was at the eastern perimeter wall again. The shadow was on the wrong side now. The sun passed its apex and beginning its slow slide toward the western ridge, the light turning from white to a color that was almost orange at the edges. She had the notebook open and she was writing, which she hadn't done in the morning sitting, because the morning sitting had been waiting and this was something different. She heard his boots on the gravel and didn't turn. You're always here, he said. It's a good thinking spot. He stopped beside her, looked out at the ridge. They're really saying you made that shot from here? He said. OP2 is close, but not from here, OP2. Different angle. She glanced at him. But close. He shook his head slowly, not in disbelief, in the way that people shake their heads when something has exceeded the frame they'd built for understanding it, and they're expanding the frame rather than rejecting the thing. I told 3 people this morning, he said, about watching you from the guard post when the round went. They didn't believe me that I was that close. You were close. I know. He paused. What did it feel like, making that shot? She looked out at the ridge. It was a question that people asked, and it was a question she'd never found a satisfying way to answer, because the honest answer didn't have the quality that people were usually looking for when they asked it. They were looking for something cinematic, the surge, the release, the moment of completion that felt proportionate to the difficulty. The honest answer was quieter than that. Like a correct calculation, she said, like getting a math problem right after working it for a long time. She paused. There's satisfaction in it, but it's not the kind you'd recognize from the outside. Okafor thought about this. Is that all it is? Calculation? No, she said. But the calculation is what makes the rest of it possible. Without the calculation, it's just... She stopped. It's just noise. He nodded slowly, taking it in. The people who made your career disappear, he said. The IG thing. Is it going to actually get them? She looked at him. He had the specific quality of someone young enough that the question was genuine. Not rhetorical, not cynical, not already answered in the asking. He actually wanted to know. The process has a real chance, she said. Whether it gets all the way there is... She paused. Uncertain. Institutions are complicated. People who have spent careers building relationships and protections don't disappear from those protections easily. So they might get away with it. Some version of it. Reduced, contested, delayed. She held his gaze. But the record exists now. What they did is on a formal record in the hands of people they can't reach. Even if the full legal consequence doesn't arrive the way it should, and I hope it does, I believe it has a real chance, the record remains. 20 years from now, someone can read that file and know exactly what happened. Okafor looked out at the ridge. That's not enough, he said. Is it? No, she said. It's not. But it's not nothing either. She paused. 2 days ago, there was no record. There was only their version. Now there's a record, and it's out of their reach. That's the difference between this morning and 2 years ago, and that difference is everything. He was quiet for a moment. I'm sorry, he said, for the first day, for what I said, what I didn't say. She looked at him. You brought me coffee, she said. He blinked. Nobody else did, she said. You brought terrible coffee and you asked questions that showed you were actually looking instead of just seeing. Give yourself some credit for that. She went back to her notebook. Mind your sector, Okafor. You've got potential. He stood there for a second. Then he laughed. A real one, surprised out of him. Yes, Corporal, he said. He walked away. She watched him go and then turned back to the notebook and the ridge and the light that was doing its late afternoon work on the desert, turning everything it touched into something that looked more significant than it had an hour ago. Hale left Fort Raven Ridge at 1700 hours. Before he left, he came to the eastern perimeter. He didn't announce he was coming. He simply appeared, which she was beginning to understand was how he operated. No announcement, no ceremony, just the direct movement of a man who went where the situation required without wasting the space between. He stood beside her and looked at the ridge. "The IG's first formal interview schedule goes out next week," he said. "You'll be contacted. Have your documentation organized." "It's organized." "I know it is." A pause. "Carver will be interviewed within the same window. His posting is being reviewed for reassignment. The JAG flagged it as potentially retaliatory pending the inquiry outcome. He may have a better posting by the end of the month." She nodded. "Reyes," Hale said, "the situation is complicated. He was operating inside the network, regardless of his stated intent. The legal process on his end is going to require—" "His testimony is genuine," she said. "Whatever he was doing, he walked into that perimeter deliberately to get on the record. That should count." "I've noted it. The JAG will note it." He looked at her. "I'm not making promises, but I've noted it." She accepted that. He looked at the ridge for another moment. "I walked past you yesterday morning," he said. "I want to say something about that." "Sir, you don't—" "I want to say it." He turned to look at her directly. "I have spent 31 years in uniform believing that I read people accurately, that I didn't make the mistake of underestimating based on presentation. Yesterday morning proved me wrong about that." He held her gaze. "I walked past you with a Barrett 50 and a notebook full of calculations, and I assessed you as support personnel. I want to say plainly that I was wrong." She looked at him. "You corrected the assessment when you had better information," she said. "I should have had better information to begin with." "Yes," she said. "You should have." He held her gaze for a moment, and she didn't soften it, because softening it would have been dishonest, and he deserved the honest answer. Then he nodded, accepting it. "Where do you go from here, Chet?" he said. "I have some time before the inquiry process requires me anywhere specific." She looked at the ridge. "I'm going to drive to a storage facility about 500 miles from here and retrieve a case that has 47 pages of cross-referenced documentation that needs to be formally submitted to the IG record." She paused. "And a letter I want to read again." He understood what kind of letter she meant without being told. After that, she thought about Briggs's question. "Ask me in 6 months. I'm going to figure out what I'm supposed to do with the rest of my operational life," she said, "which I now apparently have again." She glanced at him. "It's a strange thing, having something back that you'd adjusted to losing." "Strange how?" She considered it. "Like recalibrating a scope that's been off for 2 years," she said. "The glass is the same, the reticle is the same, but you have to relearn where zero is." Hale looked at her for a moment. "You'll find it," he said. "I know," she said. "I just need the range time." He almost smiled at that. A real one, brief, that reached his eyes before the general's face came back. "Corporal Vance," he said. "It's been—" He stopped. "I came to this base for a routine inspection. What I found was considerably more than routine." "Yes, sir." "Good work," he said. "Not just the shot, all of it." He turned and walked back toward the vehicles waiting by the main gate. She watched him go. She left Fort Raven Ridge at 0600 the following morning. The base was in its pre-dawn state when she packed the last of her things into the vehicle. The half-darkness before the sun climbed the ridge. The air still cool in the way it only managed for about 40 minutes each day before the heat reasserted itself. The Barrett was packed, the notebook was packed, the document package was secured in a waterproof case in the vehicle's locked storage compartment. Dressler shook her hand at the gate. He was not a demonstrative man, and the handshake had the quality of something that had required some decision on his part, which she appreciated. "The base will be different," he said. "It was already different," she said. "Yesterday changed it." "Yes." He paused. "You changed it." She looked at him. "The base changed it," she said. "The people on it made decisions. Hale, Kavanaugh, Briggs, Marsh, Okafor. They moved when they needed to move. I just provided the information," he said. She nodded. He let her go. Okafor was at the gate. He didn't say anything. He stood to the side, and when she drove past, he raised his hand. Not a salute exactly, more the gesture of someone marking a moment without having the words for it. She nodded through the windshield, drove out of the gate. The desert opened up in front of her the way the desert always did. Enormous and immediate, the kind of scale that reduced everything human to a small and temporary thing moving across its surface. The eastern ridge was on her right as she turned onto the main road, and she could see the overhang from here, the rock formation that had sheltered the target position. In the morning light, it was just rock, just terrain. The way all terrain was just terrain until you put a calculation behind it. She drove. The road was straight for the first 40 kilometers, running through country that didn't change fast. Flat desert floor, scrub vegetation, the occasional rock formation that broke the horizon line and gave the eye something to organize itself around. The thermometer on the vehicle's dash read 71 degrees. It would be 95 by noon. She'd be off the desert floor by then. She drove for 20 minutes before she reached for the radio and turned it on. Not military channel, civilian, something to fill the cab with something other than her own thoughts. She found a station that was mostly static with a guitar underneath it, and left it there because the static didn't bother her and the guitar was real. She thought about what Hale had said, like recalibrating a scope. You have to relearn where zero is. She'd said it without thinking, which was usually when she said the most accurate things. The 0 point was where the bullet hit where you were aiming. Everything else, the elevation adjustments, the windage corrections, the environmental variables, was measured relative to that point. If you didn't know where your 0 was, every subsequent calculation was built on a false foundation. For 2 years she had known what she was doing and why and who she was doing it for. The why being the record, the truth on paper, the thing that couldn't be walked back. That had been her 0 point, and she'd held it steadily enough to get here. What she didn't yet know was what the 0 point became now. Not the mission, the person. Who Elise Vance was when she wasn't Ghost Viper chasing ghosts. That question didn't have an answer yet, and she'd learned enough in 11 years to know that forcing an answer before it was ready produced something that sounded like an answer and functioned like a guess. The answer would develop, the information would come. She had to collect it the way she collected everything, patiently, from multiple sources, without assuming she knew the conclusion before the data was in. She drove. The guitar on the static radio resolved briefly into something she almost recognized and then fell back into static, and she left it there. 50 kilometers from Fort Raven Ridge, on a long straight section of empty road with no other vehicle visible in either direction, she pulled over. Got out. Stood beside the vehicle in the morning desert air, the cool that was already starting to warm at the edges, and looked back the way she'd come. The ridge was visible from here, a dark line against the brightening sky. The same ridge she'd been looking at from the perimeter wall for 6 weeks. The same ridge where the target position had been. The same terrain she'd been mapping and measuring and learning since day one. She stood and looked at it for a long moment. Then she got back in the vehicle and drove forward. 3 weeks later, in a regional IG field office that smelled of industrial carpet and recirculated air, Elise Vance sat across from 2 investigators and gave a 7-hour formal testimony. She had the document package. She had the 47 pages from the storage facility. She had the timeline, the cross-references, the chain of custody for every piece of physical evidence, the methodology for every inference she'd drawn, and the honest acknowledgement of where her methodology had been unconventional and why. She answered every question directly. She corrected one of the investigators twice when his questions contained embedded assumptions that weren't supported by the record. She asked for a 5-minute break once, at hour 4, and used it to stand in a hallway and drink water from a paper cup and look at a wall that had nothing on it. Then she went back in and finished. At the end of the 7th hour, the lead investigator, a woman named Fontaine, who had the focused, slightly exhausted quality of someone doing genuinely important work under resource constraints, set her pen down and looked across the table. "Corporal Vance," she said, "I want to be straightforward with you about something. Please. This investigation is going to be long and it's going to be contested. The individuals named in this record have resources and they will use them. There will be procedural challenges, timeline disputes, credibility attacks." She held Elise's gaze. "It is possible that the outcome when it arrives will be less than what the evidence warrants." "I know," Elise said. And? Elise looked at the document package on the table between them. The 47 pages. The printed drive content, Carver's testimony, Reyes's testimony. The chain of custody records built with Hale's careful architecture. The record exists, she said. It's here, it's in your hands. Whatever the legal process produces, she paused. The record exists and it can't be taken back. That's what I came for. Fontaine looked at her for a moment. Most people would want more than that, she said. Most people haven't spent 2 years understanding the difference between what they want and what's possible. Fontaine picked her pen back up, made a note, looked up. For what it's worth, she said. The record is strong, stronger than most of what comes through this office. She paused. I think it has a real chance. Elise nodded, stood up, picked up the document package. Then let the process run, she said. That's all I'm asking. She walked out of the field office into an afternoon that was overcast and cool, nothing like Fort Raven Ridge, a different sky entirely, and stood on the sidewalk for a moment with the case under her arm and the traffic noise of a medium-sized city around her. She took out her phone, scrolled to a number she'd added 3 weeks ago, typed, "Testimony complete. Package is with the IG. How are you holding up?" 20 seconds later, Carver replied, "Terrible coffee. We'll survive. Good work, Ghost Viper." She put the phone away, looked up at the overcast sky. For 2 years she had carried the weight of a truth that had no official existence, a truth that lived only in her memory and her notebook, and eventually in 47 cross-referenced pages in a waterproof case. She had carried it without complaint and without the relief of being believed, and without any guarantee that carrying it would change anything. She had carried it because it was true, because some things should be on the record, and because the alternative, letting the story end where they wanted it to end, with her silence and her disappearance and the comfortable fiction of a missed shot and a flawed operator, was not something she was capable of accepting. Not because of pride, because of what she knew. You cannot be silent about the truth and simultaneously expect the truth to survive. Silence is not neutral. Silence is a decision, and the decision has consequences, and the consequences fall on the people who come after you. The next person put in the same position, the next career built on the same rotten foundation, the next truth that gets buried because the last one wasn't worth enough to someone to carry it out into the light. She had decided it was worth enough. 2 years ago, in the wreckage of a career that had been deliberately demolished, she had made that decision. It had cost her. It had cost Carver. It had cost days and months, and the kind of sustained effort that doesn't look heroic from the outside because it looks like a woman sitting alone at a perimeter wall with a notebook. But the record existed, and the record was out of reach. She walked to her car, got in, drove. The city gave way to highway, and the highway opened up, and she drove with the window down, and the overcast sky above her, and the road ahead going somewhere she hadn't fully mapped yet, which was all right. She'd learned to read the terrain as she went. The truth doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with ceremony or guarantee. Most of the time it arrives in pieces, over years, through the work of people who decided the carrying was worth the cost. People nobody noticed, sitting in corners, running calculations that looked like obsession and were actually preparation. Those people rarely get thanked on time, but they never